The morning of Mabel Cross's wedding started the way most mornings in Red Hollow started, with dust. It rose off the main road in thin, pale clouds, stirred up by wagon wheels and boot heels, and the general business of a frontier town waking itself into another day. The sky overhead was the washed-out blue of old denim, wide and flat, and indifferent in the way that only the open plain sky could be. By 7 in the morning, the sun was already doing its worst, and by 8, the women who'd gathered at the church to help with the preparations were fanning themselves with folded paper and complaining about the heat with the comfortable ease of people who had nothing more serious to worry about. Mabel Cross was not among the women complaining. She was in the small back room of First Community Church, standing very still while her mother's hands worked at the buttons along the back of her dress, and she was thinking, with a kind of desperate, deliberate focus, about absolutely nothing. The dress was ivory. She'd made it herself over the course of 4 months, stitching it in the evenings after the household chores were finished, unpicking seams that didn't lie flat, redoing the collar 3 times because it kept pulling to the left. The fabric was the most expensive thing she'd ever purchased. A fine cotton muslin she'd ordered from a catalog and waited 6 weeks for, budgeting carefully, setting aside coins from her mending work and the occasional pie she sold at the market. The dress had taken her longer than anything she'd ever sewn. It was also, by a wide margin, the most beautiful thing she'd ever made. She was not a beautiful woman. She knew this the way she knew the weather or the price of flour. Not bitterly, not particularly, just as a fact of the world that she'd long since organized her life around. She was large in the way that some women were large on the frontier, where the work was physical and the winters were hard, and the body built itself for endurance rather than elegance. Her face was plain, her hands were square and capable. She had kind eyes, if you looked for them, dark brown, a little heavy-lidded, the kind of eyes that notice things. But most people in Red Hollow did not look for her eyes. Most people in Red Hollow had already decided what Mabel Cross was before she walked into any room. "Hold still," her mother said. Edna Cross was a thin, nervous woman with a habit of talking around things rather than at them. She'd spent the better part of the morning making observations about the weather, the state of the church linens, and the quality of the flowers that the Hendricks girl had arranged near the altar. Anything, Mabel understood, except what was actually sitting between them. "I am holding still." "You're breathing too much." "I'm breathing exactly the right amount, Mama." Edna made a sound that could have meant anything and went back to the buttons. Outside the small window, Mabel could hear the sound of wagons arriving, the murmur of voices, the particular social hum of a community gathering for an event. Red Hollow turned out for weddings. It turned out for funerals too, but weddings had better food and offered more to discuss afterward. "He's going to be there," Mabel said. It came out more like a question than she'd intended. Her mother's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, then continued. "Of course he is," Edna said. "Don't be foolish." Thomas Hale was 29 years old, the son of a moderately successful feed merchant, and he had proposed to Mabel Cross on a Tuesday evening in March with the careful, business-like demeanor of a man completing a transaction he'd already thought through. There had been no particular romance to it. He'd come to the house, sat across from her at the kitchen table, and explained that he needed a wife who was practical, capable, and unlikely to cause him trouble, and that he thought she fit those requirements. He had said this, Mabel reflected later, the way you describe purchasing a reliable workhorse. She'd said yes anyway, because she was 26 years old and had begun to understand with a clarity that was almost peaceful that the romantic proposals were going to the other women, the ones whose names the boys said differently, whose arrivals at social gatherings caused a subtle realignment in the room. Mabel had watched this happen for years, had watched the way men's faces changed when Clara Whitfield walked in, or Lena Marsh, or any one of a dozen women whose particular arrangement of features the town had collectively decided mattered. And she'd understood, not with self-pity, but with something colder and more resigned, that she was not that kind of woman. Thomas Hale's proposal had not been poetry, but it had been real, and she had taken it. "There," her mother said, finishing the last button. She stepped back and looked at Mabel with an expression that was trying very hard to be something warmer than careful. "You look nice." "Thank you, Mama." "The dress is beautiful." "Thank you." There was a knock at the door, and Reverend Aldous Crane's wife, Patricia, leaned in with the bright, slightly performative smile she wore at community events. "Nearly ready, dear? The pews are filling up." "Nearly," Mabel said, She turned to look at herself in the small, slightly warped mirror propped against the wall. The dress was genuinely beautiful. The lines clean and careful, the fit as good as she could manage, the collar finally lying flat. She'd done her hair pinned up the way she'd practiced, a few strands loose at the temples the way she'd seen in the Harper's magazine that had passed through the lending library last autumn. She looked like herself, just herself, in a very good dress. "All right," she said, mostly to the mirror. "All right." The church was full. Red Hollow was not a large town, perhaps 200 souls in the town proper, with another 100 or so scattered across the surrounding homesteads and ranches, but it was the kind of place where a wedding drew people out in force, because there weren't that many occasions that drew people together, and most of them didn't want to miss it. The pews were filled with faces Mabel had known her whole life. The Donovan family up front, their 6 children arranged by size like a set of nesting dolls. Old Marcus Webb in the third row, who'd been deaf in one ear since 1871 and compensated by watching people's mouths with unsettling intensity. The Presley sisters, Georgia and Faye, who'd been Mabel's schoolmates and who exchanged a glance with each other when she appeared in the doorway that she didn't have time to fully interpret. She walked up the aisle on her father's arm. Robert Cross was a quiet, weathered man who smelled of tobacco and saddle leather, and who had expressed his feelings about his daughter's upcoming marriage by polishing his boots until she could see her reflection in them. He was not a man who talked about things, but he held her arm with both hands as they walked, and the pressure of that grip said what he apparently couldn't. She fixed her eyes on the altar, and on Thomas Hale, standing at the front of the church in his good black coat, his hat held in both hands, his back very straight, except he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hat, at the floor, at some point between the two that seemed to require his full and concentrated attention. His jaw was set. There was something about the angle of his shoulders, too rigid, too deliberate, that Mabel recognized from the way men stood when they'd made a decision they weren't sure they could actually carry out. She kept walking. Because what else do you do when you're halfway up the aisle and 47 people are watching? She reached the altar. Her father released her arm with a slight squeeze, something that might have been reassurance or might have been apology, and stepped back. Reverend Crane opened his Bible. The church went quiet, and Thomas Hale looked at her. She saw it in his face before he said a word. She would replay this moment many times in the years that followed, turning it over in her memory with the compulsive attention you give to things you can't stop examining, and what she always came back to was not the words, because the words, when they came, were almost beside the point, but the expression. The combination of shame and relief and something almost like impatience that moved across his features as he looked at her and then, visibly, made his choice. "Mabel," he said. And then, after a pause that lasted approximately 3 years, "I can't do this." And the silence in the church was so complete that she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. Then, as if someone had turned a valve, the room filled with noise. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the pews, a child's voice asking something, immediately hushed, the sound of rustling fabric as people shifted in their seats, turning to each other, turning to look at her. Mabel stood very still at the altar. There was a moment, and this was the part she couldn't fully explain, even later, even to herself, where she felt almost entirely separate from what was happening, like she was watching it from a slight remove, like her body was there at the altar in the beautiful ivory dress, and her mind was somewhere else entirely, hovering near the rafters maybe, watching this happen to that woman down there in the good dress. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. He sounded it, actually. He looked it. He also looked, she noticed from her slight remove, like a man in a considerable hurry to be somewhere else. "I've thought about it a great deal, and I can't." He stopped, started again. "This isn't the right thing." "For you," she said. Her voice came out level. She had no idea how. "For either of us." He seemed to take some comfort in this reframing because his shoulders lowered slightly. "We both deserve better than a marriage that doesn't. He gestured vaguely with his hat, apparently unable to locate the ending of that sentence. Reverend Crane was making some kind of noise. Patricia Crane had appeared at his elbow. Somewhere in the pews, Georgia Presley was whispering something to her sister with an expression that Mabel did not need to see in detail to understand. "You should go," Mabel said to Thomas. Something passed over his face. Gratitude, maybe. Or just relief. He nodded once, tersely, And then he walked past her down the aisle, quickly, not quite running, but moving with the purposeful stride of a man who wanted to be out a door as soon as possible. And then he was gone, the heavy wooden doors of the church settling behind him with a sound that seemed, in the silence, almost comically definitive. 47 people looked at Mabel Cross. She stood at the altar for a moment that she would later describe to exactly no one, because there were no adequate words for it. That raw, unprotected, skin-scraped feeling of standing in front of everyone you've ever known while they absorbed the fact of your rejection and filed it away in their understanding of who you were. She heard someone say, not quite quietly enough, well, she must have known it was too good to be true. She heard someone else. She was fairly sure it was Ida Coleman, who was 73 and had always had a talent for the devastatingly obvious. Say, poor thing. She turned from the altar and she began walking back down the aisle. Her legs were working correctly. Her face was doing something. She couldn't have said exactly what, but she had the impression it was doing something fairly controlled, or at least not actively falling apart, which was the most she could reasonably hope for. She kept her eyes straight ahead, aimed at the back wall of the church and the doors that Thomas Hale had just gone through, and she put one foot in front of the other. The faces on either side of the aisle were a blur. A collective, watching blur, craning slightly toward her the way people crane toward accidents. She was maybe 3 rows from the doors when she heard the voice. Miss Cross? It came from the back of the church, off to the left, the corner pews where the latecomers and the people without strong social investments usually ended up. She almost didn't stop. She wasn't sure, in that particular moment, that she could afford to stop. But something in the voice, the quietness of it, and the steadiness, the absence of any of the tones she'd been bracing for, made her turn her head. He was sitting in the very last pew. She didn't know him well, had seen him around town a handful of times, knew him by name the way you knew most people in a town of Red Hollow's size without really knowing them. Wyatt Granger. He ran a cattle ranch somewhere up past the northern hills, came into town occasionally for supplies, didn't make a particular impression one way or another, except that he was quiet and seemed to listen more than he talked, which was less common than it should have been. He was standing now, hat in his hands. Men in Red Hollow were always standing with their hats in their hands, she thought absurdly, and then pressed that thought down, and looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not the avid sympathy that was just another shape of satisfaction. Something more direct than either of those. I'm not going to ask if you're all right, he said. I figure that's a question you're fairly tired of already. Something shifted in her chest, a small, involuntary movement, like a lock giving. I was thinking, he continued, and his voice was still that same steady, carrying without effort quiet, that you might want to get out of here. There's a wagon out front. I'd be glad to drive you wherever you need to go. Mabel looked at him for a moment. Around them, the church was still full of people and noise and the collective buzzing energy of a community that had just been given the best piece of gossip they'd had all year. She could feel it like a physical thing, that attention. She could feel it landing on her back, her shoulders, the back of her head. Why? She asked. Wyatt Granger thought about this for a second, as though it was a question that deserved an honest answer rather than a social one. Because, he said, it seems like the decent thing to do. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, all right. The wagon was a working wagon, rough wood boards, the smell of hay, and something animal underneath it. A horse who was sensible rather than pretty, and who regarded Mabel with the calm indifference of a creature that had better things to think about. Wyatt helped her up onto the seat without making a production of it, without the complicated mixture of solicitude and condescension that large women often got from men attempting to assist them. And then he went around and climbed up himself and took the reins. He didn't say anything. He clicked to the horse, and the wagon started rolling, and they moved out of the churchyard and onto the main road, and the church receded behind them. They went a block, 2 blocks. Where would you like to go? He asked. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She was still holding the small bunch of flowers she'd been carrying, had apparently carried them all the way down the aisle and out of the church without consciously deciding to. The same way you sometimes found yourself doing things in a crisis that your body had decided on without consulting you. I don't know, she said. It was the most honest answer she'd given anyone all morning. He nodded, as though this was a perfectly reasonable response, and kept driving. They went through town, past the general store, past the post office, past the feed merchants that belonged to Thomas Hale's father, where she resolutely did not look. and out the other side onto the road that led north, toward the hills. "Where does this road go?" she asked, after they'd been traveling in silence for a few minutes. "My ranch, eventually. About 4 miles up." She thought about that. "I can't go to my parents' house," she said. Not right now was what she meant. Not with all of this sitting on top of her. Not back into those small rooms with her mother's careful not speaking and her father's helpless silences. Not to be looked at and worried over and talked around. And I can't go back to the boarding house. She'd been renting a room at Mrs. Thatcher's boarding house for 2 years, since the situation with her brother's family had made living at home complicated. The boarding house was on the main street. Not today. No, Wyatt agreed. He seemed to understand what she wasn't saying. Not today. She was quiet for a moment. "Is there somewhere I could sit?" she said. "For a while. Somewhere quiet." "Yes," he said. "There is." His property was 4 miles past the edge of town, up a road that climbed gradually through dry grass and scattered cottonwood, the hills rising on either side until the town disappeared entirely behind them, and there was just the land, wide and rough and sun-struck, the grass silver gold in the morning light, a hawk turning slow circles above a ridge to the east. The ranch itself was not impressive. She could see that as they came down the last stretch of road, a main house built of weathered timber, a barn in somewhat better repair, a series of pens and outbuildings in various states of functional disrepair, a kitchen garden off to one side that was clearly being maintained by someone who knew what they were doing, even if they didn't have much time for it. It was a working ranch. Everything about it said work, said effort, said a place organized entirely around what it needed to do rather than how it looked doing it. There was a creek behind the house, Wyatt told her. She could sit there if she liked. He'd put some coffee on. She changed out of the ivory dress first. He found her an old shirt and a pair of work trousers that were several sizes too large and that she belted with a length of rope. And then she went and sat on the bank of the creek in the ill-fitting work clothes with her wedding dress folded carefully beside her, and she listened to the water. It was a small creek. It made a modest, competent sound over its stones. The cottonwoods along the bank threw patches of shade that shifted in the light wind. Something moved in the tall grass across the water. Some small animal going about its small animal business with the complete lack of concern that small animals in good habitat generally managed. She sat for a long time. She was not, she noticed, crying. She'd expected to cry. Had sort of been waiting for it. The collapse that should come after that kind of sustained effort, that long walk down a very public aisle. But what she felt wasn't quite grief, or at least not only grief. It was something older than that, something that had been sitting in her chest for a long time, that Thomas Hale's particular act of cowardice had only made visible. He hadn't wanted her. That was the fact of it. And the more painful, longer-standing fact underneath that one was that she'd known it. Had known it on some level since that Tuesday evening in March, when he'd sat across from her at the kitchen table with his businesslike manner and his list of practical requirements. And she'd said yes anyway, because she'd been afraid that no was the only other option, and that no meant forever and alone, and all the things she'd spent years carefully not thinking about. She picked up a stone from the bank and turned it over in her hand. It was smooth and slightly flat, the color of old pewter. Poor thing, Ida Coleman had said. She threw the stone into the creek. It landed with a small, efficient splash and was gone. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the bank. And then Wyatt was there, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, picking his way through the cottonwood roots with the care of a man who'd done it enough times to know where the treacherous ones were. He lowered himself onto the bank a few feet away from her with the deliberateness of someone whose knees had their own opinions about certain kinds of movements. He held out one of the cups. She took it. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't require filling. "You've been on this land long?" she asked eventually. 12 years, he said. "Alone?" "Mostly." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Had a hired man for a while. Good worker. He married and moved on to his own place. That's generally what happens when they're worth keeping." She nodded. She was quiet for another moment. "People are going to talk," she said. "Yes. About this. About—" She gestured imprecisely in the direction of the road that led back to town. "All of it. About me coming out here?" "Probably," he agreed. "Does that concern you?" He seemed to think about it genuinely, rather than reaching for reassurance. "It's a fair question," he said, I've got some things I want to say about it, but I don't want to say them in a way that sounds like I'm making promises I can't keep. She looked at him. His profile was angular, weathered, not handsome in any conventional sense. But there was a quality to his face that she found herself looking at directly, which was not always a thing she managed with people. A quality of being inhabited, she thought, of being genuinely there. Then don't make promises, she said. Just tell me what you think. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think people are going to talk regardless of where you go and what you do. That's the kind of thing that doesn't change just because you make choices to accommodate it. He paused. And what I think, is that you seem like someone who might need a place to be for a while, where it's quiet, where nobody's looking at you. He stopped, turned his cup in his hands. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying anything else. Mabel looked at the creek. She thought about the boarding house on the main street, where Mrs. Thatcher would be kind and well-meaning and very full of questions. She thought about her parents' house and her mother's careful buttons and her father's polished boots. She thought about the church and the faces in the pews and the sound of Thomas Hale's feet on the floorboards as he walked away from her. She thought about the small stone she'd thrown into the creek, the way it had gone in and disappeared. You'd need someone to keep up the kitchen garden, she said. It's a mess. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a slight recalibration, as though he was adjusting to a version of events that was moving slightly faster than he'd anticipated. It is, he agreed. And the fencing on the west side of that pasture we came past, the lower section, where it runs along the road, 2 of those posts are leaning. If a post goes down in that section, you'll lose cattle to the creek trail. A pause. You saw that on the way in? He asked. I noticed things, she said, not particularly modestly, because she did notice things, and it seemed like unnecessary false humility to pretend she didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, This would be a practical arrangement, work in exchange for room and board, nothing else being suggested. I understand that, she said, and you'd be welcome to leave whenever you wanted. I know. The creek moved over its stones. The hawk was still working the eastern ridge, rising and banking on the thermal, indifferent to the arrangements of the 2 people sitting far below it. I'd want to keep sewing, she said, in the evenings when the work's done. I take in mending. I could maybe do more than that, if I had a place to do it. There's a room with good light, Wyatt said. East-facing, good in the mornings. She thought about it for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and stood, brushing the creek bank dirt from the borrowed trousers. All right, she said, show me the fencing. He stood too, looked at her for a moment. Not in the way people usually looked at her, which was to say not as though they were taking inventory, not as though her appearance was the first and most important data point available. Just looked at her, the way you might look at someone you were beginning to pay attention to. This way, he said, and started toward the pasture. That afternoon, they walked the west fence line. It was hot work in the afternoon sun, the kind of work that stripped you down to what you actually were, because the heat didn't care about your dignity, and the land didn't care about your circumstances, and the fence posts were what they were, regardless of what you'd been through that morning. Mabel found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was grateful for it. The physical straightforwardness of it. The fact that a leaning post was a leaning post and either needed fixing or it didn't, and the answer to that question had nothing to do with the shape of her body or the state of her social standing. She was not a woman who'd avoided hard work. Her hands were calloused in ways that spoke to years of it. The sewing work, mostly, but also the practical work of running a household, the gardening and lifting and carrying that frontier women did as a matter of basic necessity. She was strong in the low, settled way that large people often were, not showy about it, but genuinely capable, built for endurance. She and Wyatt pulled 3 posts and reset them, tamping the earth back in around the bases while the sun moved toward the west and the shadows lengthened in the grass. He didn't treat her like someone in need of protection from the work. He handed her the tamping bar when it was her turn and accepted it back when it was his, and they fell into the rhythm of it without discussion, the way people did when they were both paying attention to the same task. You know fencing, he said at one point. A statement, not a question. My father had a property outside town when I was younger, she said. Before the drought took it, we all worked it. He nodded, didn't pursue it. She appreciated that. When they finished and started back toward the house, the light was going golden, and the air was cooling slightly, and Mabel Cross was sweaty and dusty and still wearing borrowed clothes 3 sizes too large, and she noticed this with a kind of distant curiosity, more like herself than she had in months. Maybe longer than months. That evening, she sat in the east-facing room with the last of the daylight and her sewing kit, which she'd brought in the small bag she'd managed to grab from the church before leaving. She'd had it packed for the travel to Thomas Hale's family property that was supposed to come after the wedding, and the sewing kit was in it because she always had the sewing kit, the way some people always had a book or a flask. She sat in the east-facing room and she mended a shirt of Wyatt's that she'd found on the mending pile because there was a mending pile, and because it needed doing, and because her hands needed something. Through the window, she could see the last of the sky going from orange to a deep, saturated blue. She thought about Red Hollow, about the church, and the faces, about Georgia Presley's whispered conversation with her sister, about Thomas Hale and his hat, and his particular way of making even his rejections sound like they were for her benefit. She thought about all the ways she'd made herself smaller over the years. Not smaller in body, that was the joke. The irony the town would have appreciated, but smaller in expectation, smaller in hope, smaller in the amount of space she allowed herself to take up in her own life. The shirt in her hands had a tear along the collar seam that had been improperly done the first time and had pulled out as a result. She picked out the old stitching carefully, all of it, down to where the seam was good. You couldn't fix a thing like this by patching over the bad work. You had to go back to where the integrity was and start there. She rethreaded her needle. Outside, she heard Wyatt moving around in the kitchen, the sounds of a man making a simple meal, the clatter of a pan on the stove. She started stitching. Slow, careful, even, the kind of work you couldn't rush or the whole thing would show. The sky through the window went to dark. The needle moved. She did not know what was going to happen. She did not know what Red Hollow was saying about her tonight, though she could make a reasonable guess. She did not know what her mother was thinking, or whether Thomas Hale felt better or worse now that he'd done it, or what the women in the pews had said to each other on their way out of the church. What she knew was this: the shirt in her hands was going to be properly mended. The fence along the west pasture was going to hold. She was going to sleep in a quiet room tonight, and tomorrow the garden needed work, and the work was going to be there waiting for her without judgment, which was more than she could say for a considerable number of people. She kept stitching. Outside, somewhere past the ridge, a coyote sent up a long, uncomplicated sound into the dark. She did not flinch. She kept her hands steady, and she kept working, and the last of the day's light let go of the window, and the room went to lamplight, and she kept going. That was the night it began. Not with a declaration, not with a plan, with a needle and a torn seam and a woman deciding, in the quiet of a borrowed room, that she was going to start from where the integrity was and go from there. That was all. And for now, that was enough. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Mabel had expected. She'd expected the work to be hard. The physical side of it, the early mornings, the fencing and the hauling, and the long hours in the kitchen garden under a sun that didn't moderate its intentions for anyone, that she'd been prepared for. She was not a woman who'd spent her life indoors. She knew what work felt like in her body, knew the particular way her shoulders ached after a day of sustained effort and the dull, satisfying tiredness that came in the evenings when the tasks were done and the hands were still. She could handle the work. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet. The creek noise and the bird calls, and the wind through the dry grass that she'd been sitting in the previous afternoon. That kind of quiet she took to immediately, like a plant that hadn't known it was thirsty until it rained. She meant the other kind, the interior quiet that came when there was no one watching her, no eyes tracking her across a room, no conversation that was partly about the task at hand and partly about the ongoing assessment of who she was and whether she measured up. No Georgia Presley whispering, no carefully constructed expressions from people who wanted her to know they felt sorry for her without quite saying so. Just the work and the land and whatever she actually was when nobody was looking. She found that she wasn't entirely sure what that was. This bothered her more than she'd expected. She'd always thought of herself as someone who knew her own mind. Practical, unsentimental, clear-eyed about her circumstances, even when those circumstances weren't particularly favorable. But in those first few days at Wyatt's ranch, she kept catching herself waiting for something. A reaction, an evaluation, some external signal about whether she was doing adequately. And when it didn't come, when Wyatt simply went about his work and expected her to go about hers, and offered neither criticism nor excessive praise, she found herself oddly disoriented. It was like trying to walk on a surface you'd learned to expect to tilt, and then finding it level. She had to relearn how to stand, On the third morning, she got up before dawn and went out to the kitchen garden while the sky was still the particular dark blue that comes just before the light actually arrives. She'd been thinking about it since the first day. The garden was a disaster, overgrown in the places that should have been clear and bare in the places that needed attention. The soil compacted around the roots of the tomato plants, and the carrot tops ragged and going to seed. Someone had once put real thought into this garden. Recently, nobody had. She found the tools in the lean-to beside the barn, organized them by what she'd need, and got to work. The sky went from dark blue to gray to the specific pale gold that meant the sun was coming, and she kept working. She pulled the overgrowth from between the rows, working with her hands in the places where the hoe would disturb the roots she wanted to keep. She staked the tomatoes that had grown too tall and were bending under their own weight. She loosened the soil around the carrot beds and thinned them, pulling the small crowded ones out gently, working by feel as much as sight. She heard Wyatt come out of the house around 6. She recognized his footsteps by then, the particular slightly favoring quality of his right stride that told her his left knee was the one with the problem, though he never mentioned it. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at what she'd done. She kept working. After a moment, he went to the barn, and she heard him start in on the morning feeding. When she came in for breakfast an hour later, there were 2 eggs on the pan, not 1. That was all. Nothing said about it. She sat down and ate. The town came back to her in pieces, the way news did on the frontier. Not in a rush, but gradually, carried by the occasional wagon that came up the north road, or the words of the hired hand from the neighboring spread, who sometimes stopped to water his horse at the creek. What she heard, through these channels, was more or less what she'd expected. Thomas Hale had left town. This surprised nobody. His embarrassment was, in its way, nearly as complete as hers, and Red Hollow was not the kind of place that handled that sort of thing with particular delicacy. He'd gone to stay with an uncle somewhere south, and the general opinion seemed to be divided between those who thought he'd behaved disgracefully and those who thought he'd simply done what any sensible man would eventually have done, which was a distinction that did not reflect especially well on the latter group. Mabel herself was, predictably, the subject of considerable discussion. She learned this one afternoon in her second week when the neighboring hand, a young man named Cobb, who was perhaps 19 and had the slightly guilty manner of someone carrying information he wasn't sure he should be carrying, stopped at the fence line while she and Wyatt were working the east pasture. "Heard some talk in town," Cobb said, to no one in particular, which was a frontier method of making information available without technically volunteering it. Wyatt kept working. "That right?" "About—" Cobb's eyes moved briefly to Mabel and then away, with the elaborate casualness of someone trying to appear to not be looking at someone, the situation. "People talk," Wyatt said. "Some of it's fairly pointed," Cobb said, and there was something in his voice, actual discomfort, actual reluctance, that Mabel found herself unexpectedly touched by. He was a young man doing a thing he didn't particularly want to do because he'd apparently decided she should know. "About Miss Cross being here. On the ranch. Some of them are saying it's not—" He ran out of steam, tried again. "Mrs. Donnelly said it's not appropriate. That a woman in her situation has no business—" He stopped completely. The pasture was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark was making its case from somewhere in the grass to the west. "Thank you, Cobb," Mabel said. She kept her voice even. It wasn't hard exactly. She'd been expecting something along these lines. "I appreciate you saying it directly." Cobb looked relieved and vaguely mortified in equal measure. "I didn't mean to—" he started. "It's all right," she said. "Better to know." Wyatt handed the fence tool to Mabel without comment and walked the few steps to the fence line where Cobb was sitting on his horse. She couldn't hear what he said. He kept his voice low, the way some men do when they're being specific about something and don't see the need for an audience. She saw Cobb nod once, twice, and then say something back that she also couldn't hear. And then Wyatt came back to the fence line and took the tool back and went back to work. "What did you say to him?" Mabel asked. "I told him I appreciated him letting us know." "And?" A beat. "And that if Mrs. Donnelly wanted to form an opinion about what was or wasn't appropriate on my property, she was welcome to come out here and have that conversation in person." Mabel looked at him. He was focused on the fencing with the complete attention of a man who had said a thing he considered fairly simple and didn't see the need for a great deal of analysis around it. "You're going to get more of this," she said. "Probably. It might affect things. You're standing in town. Your business." He straightened up and turned to look at her then, directly, with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being serious. My business is fine, and my standing in town is not something I've put a great deal of stock in. He paused. If that changes because of something that is entirely your own matter and nobody else's, then that's more information about the town than it is about either of us. She looked at him for a moment, then she picked up the stretcher tool and went back to the fence. But she turned that over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon, the way you turned over something you'd found that you couldn't quite identify yet, but that seemed like it might be worth keeping. The sewing business started almost by accident. She'd been working on her own things in the evenings, the mending she'd brought with her from Mrs. Thatcher's boarding house, a skirt that needed taking in, a coat that had seen better days but could be salvaged with some attention. She'd set herself up in the east-facing room with a chair she'd dragged close to the window for the morning light, and she worked in the evenings by the lamp after the day's outdoor work was done. It was Wyatt who mentioned one evening about 10 days in that he had 2 shirts that he'd been meaning to have looked at, and that there was apparently nobody in town who did the work at a quality worth paying for since Mrs. Okafor had retired. She looked at the shirts. One had a collar that had separated from the body of the shirt along the wrong grain and couldn't be properly reattached. It needed a new collar cut and set. The other had a seam issue at the shoulder that had been mended once already, and incorrectly. So the mend had pulled and was now worse than the original problem. She fixed them both. It took her 2 evenings, working carefully, and when she handed them back she could tell from the way he held them up and examined them that he was surprised, not at her specifically, but at the quality of the work. He paid her what she said the work was worth and didn't negotiate. A week later, Cobb appeared at the ranch house on an errand that was only partly about borrowing a particular piece of equipment and mentioned, with a casualness that she suspected was practiced, that he had a coat that needed some attention, if she had the time. She did the coat. She charged him fairly. He mentioned it to someone. Someone mentioned it to someone else. Within a month, she had more work than she could handle in the evenings alone, and she'd started getting up an hour earlier to work in the mornings too, in the east-facing room before the outdoor work claimed the day. She was not operating a business. She was careful about how she thought of it at this stage. It was work she did, work people brought her, work she was paid for, nothing more formal than that. But she could feel the shape of something larger underneath it, the way you could sometimes feel the shape of ground under floodwater even when you couldn't see it. What she'd learned about her own sewing over the years was that she could do more than mend. That was what most people thought of when they thought of a woman who sewed, mending, alterations, the maintenance and repair end of the thing. But she could draft a pattern from scratch, could take measurements and build a garment from nothing, could look at a worn piece of clothing and see clearly not just what it needed, but what it could be. She'd been doing it her whole life with limited resources and limited time, and she'd gotten very good at the problem-solving part of it, the figuring out, with the material and the tools available, what was actually possible. One evening, working late by the lamp, she thought, what if I actually gave it space to be what it could be? She didn't say this out loud. She wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. But she kept the thought and turned it over and didn't put it down. Tom. The frontier had its own rhythms of disaster, and Wyatt's ranch was not exempt from them. The 3rd week brought a 3-day storm. Not rain, but wind, the kind that came off the flatland to the northwest and hit the hills and didn't know what to do with itself except intensify. It brought dust and killed 2 young calves that had been born only days before, their mothers not yet experienced enough to shelter them adequately. And it tore a section of roof from the smaller outbuilding and drove a crack through the east wall of the barn that let in enough cold to threaten the rest of the calving season. Wyatt worked the storm straight through, sleeping 3 hours the first night and apparently not at all the second. Mabel found this out not because he said anything about it, but because she heard him in the barn at 4 in the morning, and when she went out at 5 with coffee and the lantern, the expression on his face had the particular quality of someone running on something thinner than sleep. I can take the next 2 hours, she said. He looked at her. Go sleep, she said. I know what to watch for. I've done calving before. It's rough in there, he said. I can see that. He was quiet for a moment. She knew he was doing the math, the size of her against what he assumed she could handle, the natural frontier man's calculation about women and difficult work. She watched him do it and didn't say anything else, just held the coffee out and waited. He took the coffee, drank it, handed the cup back. 3rd stall from the right, he said. She's the one to watch. All right. He went to the house. She went into the barn. The 3rd stall from the right was a young cow, her first calf, and she was nervous and exhausted, and the calf was not yet properly on its feet. Mabel spent 2 hours in that stall, keeping the cow calm, helping the calf find its footing, talking to them both in the low, even voice that animals responded to regardless of the words. The tone was the thing, the steadiness of it, the signal that everything was proceeding within the expected range of terrible. By the time Wyatt came back at 7, the calf was standing and nursing, and Mabel was sitting against the wall of the stall with hay in her hair and what was definitely not only mud on her work coat, and she was obscurely completely fine. Wyatt stood at the stall gate for a moment and looked at the calf. "Good," he said. "You should probably eat something," she said. He looked at her then, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that moved across his face briefly before he put it away somewhere. "So should you," he said. "You've been out here longer than I have." She got up. The calf took a step and found its feet and took another, working through the process with the focused determination of a creature that has decided to exist and is not going to be talked out of it. She watched it for a moment. "Storm should break tonight," Wyatt said. "Good. The garden's taken enough." They went to the house. She made eggs because they were fast and she was hungry, and they ate standing at the kitchen counter because neither of them had the energy to sit down, and outside the wind kept doing its thing against the walls of the house, and neither of them said much about any of it. That was a good morning, she thought later. Not an easy one, but good. The middle weeks, she was at the ranch a month now, then more, were defined by a kind of daily rhythm that she found herself settling into with something that surprised her by being very close to comfort. Early mornings in this garden or the barn, depending on what needed doing, the outdoor work through the middle part of the day, fencing, the hauling and stacking and fixing that a working ranch produced in steady, unrelenting quantities. Evenings at the sewing with the lamp lit and the sounds of the cooling land outside. Late enough into the night that she sometimes caught herself listing toward the table, needle in hand, and had to put the work down before she made a mistake she'd have to unpick. She and Wyatt had developed, over these weeks, the particular efficient language of two people who worked alongside each other daily and had stopped wasting words on things that didn't require them. He would indicate something needed doing with a gesture or a few words, and she would nod or ask a question if she had one, and that was generally the extent of it. It was not unfriendly. It was the language of people who were busy and trusted each other to be competent. But there were evenings. After supper and that hour before she went to the sewing room, and he did whatever he did in the evenings, read, generally, or mended tack with the focused patience of a man who found the work meditative, there was sometimes a stretch of time where they sat on the porch and just existed in the cooling air. These weren't conversations exactly, or they were conversations that consisted mostly of silence with occasional words dropped in, the way you might drop stones in water just to watch the ripples. He told her, in one of these evenings, that he'd grown up in Ohio, that his family had farmed there. Good land, reliable rain, nothing like the frontier. That he'd come west at 22 because the farm was his father's, and his father had two other sons who were better suited to working with him, and he'd understood that the most useful thing he could do was be somewhere else. That sounds lonelier than it needed to be, she said. He thought about it. Some, he said. I didn't mind it as much as I might have. I'm not bad company for myself. That's a useful quality to have. What about you? He asked. You've always been in Red Hollow? Born there. Grew up there. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think I'd leave, when I was younger. I had ideas about... She stopped. Started again. I thought I'd do something. With the sewing. Open a shop somewhere that had enough people to support it. Have a real business. She said the last two words with a slight, self-aware irony, the tone of someone acknowledging a younger self with complicated feelings. Then time passed, and I convinced myself it wasn't practical, and I stopped thinking about it. Mum. What made it not practical? She considered the question honestly, the way he generally asked questions, expecting a real answer rather than a social one. I told myself it was money, she said. And it partly was, but if I'm being accurate about it, she paused. I think I mostly convinced myself that wanting things was something other people did. People who were... She looked for the word. Allowed to. The porch was quiet. Somewhere down the creek, a frog was making its business known to the evening. You thought you weren't allowed to want things, he said. Not a question, just him being accurate. I thought it was impractical. That's what I told myself. You think there's a difference? She turned the porch rail under her hands, feeling the slight roughness where the paint had come away. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I've been thinking about it more than I expected to." He didn't press it. He looked out at the darkening land and let her keep the thought, which was, she was finding, a consistent quality of his, that he let you keep things until you were ready to do something with them. Well, her mother came in the 5th week. She came on a Tuesday in the family's small wagon, and she came alone, which told Mabel something about the state of things at home and in town that a great deal of reported gossip wouldn't have. Her mother sat across from her at Wyatt's kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her and her expression pulled into the particular configuration of a woman who had been practicing what she wanted to say and was discovering, now that she was here, that it was coming out differently than rehearsed. "People are saying things," her mother began. "I know. Mabel, you've been out here 5 weeks. I know how long I've been here. And people are talking about it in ways that I—" Edna stopped, restarted. "Your father thinks you should come home. I know he does. And I think—" Another stop. Her hands tightened on each other slightly. "I think I understand why you can't. I don't entirely understand Mr. Granger or the arrangement, but I think I understand why the house feels too small right now." She looked at her daughter with an expression that was, stripped of the nervousness, actually quite direct. "I just need to know you're all right." Mabel looked at her mother, at the worry in her face, which was real. Whatever else complicated their relationship, the worry was always real. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm better than I was." "That's—" Her mother's voice shifted slightly. "That's good. That's what I needed to hear." They sat for a moment in the kitchen, with the sounds of the ranch outside, a cow calling from the pasture, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant sound of Wyatt somewhere doing something that needed doing. "Your dress is—" Her mother looked at the work clothes. The borrowed shirt, better fitting now because she'd altered it herself. The trousers that were her own by now, really, re-hemmed and worn in. "I know," Mabel said, not unkindly. "You look—" Her mother seemed to be searching for the word and landing slowly on something honest. "You look different. I've been working hard. It's not just that." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You look like you're standing on something solid." Mabel was quiet. "I think I might be," she said. What she hadn't told her mother, and hadn't said aloud to anyone, was what was happening with the sewing work, because it was expanding in ways that had started to feel like something she couldn't keep calling a side activity and pretending it was nothing particular. She had more work than she could keep up with in the evenings. She'd started taking on pieces that weren't just mending or repair. A full skirt for the wife of a rancher to the east, cut from fabric the woman had brought out herself. A coat for a boy who'd outgrown his in the middle of the season, reconstructed from his father's older one. She was known now in the immediate area around the ranch, not widely, but among the people who moved along the North Road and the cross-country tracks between the spreads, which was its own kind of distribution. And she'd been thinking about Red Hollow, and about the women in Red Hollow, and about what women on the frontier generally needed in terms of clothing. What they needed and what they were able to get, which were two significantly different things. You could order from the catalogs, if you had the time and the patience, and the ability to trust that the measurements you sent would result in something that fit a body that was anything other than the idealized body the catalogs seemed to assume. Most women she knew had boxes in their attics full of catalog purchases that didn't fit and couldn't be returned. The ready-made clothing made for the generic woman, the average woman, the woman who did not actually exist anywhere in the specific and variable way that real women existed. She'd been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about what she could do that a catalog couldn't. She hadn't said any of this to Wyatt. Not because she thought he wouldn't be interested, but because it wasn't fully formed yet. It was still the stage of an idea where saying it out loud too early could break something in it before it had time to solidify. She knew this about herself. She was a person who needed to hold a plan in her own hands for a while before she could hand it to anyone else. But one evening, later than usual, when she'd been working on a skirt alteration that was more complicated than it looked, she came out to find Wyatt still on the porch. The night was clear. The storms had been gone a week now. And the sky was something, out here away from the town's lights. More stars than seemed reasonable. More depth than you knew sky had, until you looked at it properly. She sat down. "I'm going to go back to town," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Next week. Maybe the week after." She folded her hands in her lap. I have some things I want to do there. The sewing, he said. She looked at him. She hadn't told him, but she thought about the mornings she'd been working early, the orders that had been coming in, the conversations she'd had with the women who brought their work out from the neighboring spreads. He was not a man who missed things just because he didn't mention them. The sewing, she agreed. You'll stay here? He asked. Careful with the question. She could hear the care in it. She thought about that, about the east-facing room, and the work, and the creek, and the calf that had found its feet in the middle of a 3-day storm, about the man sitting next to her, who consistently said less than most people and meant more. Yes, she said, if that's all right. It's all right, he said. The stars did their enormous quiet business above the ridge. I'm going to fail at some of it, she said. Probably. Probably, he agreed. People are going to have opinions. They're going to have opinions about you regardless. Might as well give them something real to have opinions about. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. That's a very particular kind of encouragement, she said. It's honest, he said. I find honest more useful than particular. She was quiet for a moment. The frog down at the creek was at it again. The same one, she thought, or at least the same spot. I used to want to open a shop, she said, years ago, before I talked myself out of it. He waited. I think I might not talk myself out of it this time, she said. The words came out more steadily than she'd expected. More certain. He didn't say anything right away, just sat with it, the way he sat with things, not rushing to respond, not filling the space. Good, he said finally. Just that. She looked out at the dark hills, the land she'd been learning for 6 weeks, its moods and rhythms, its capacity for difficulty, and also for this, for the quiet stretch of a clear night with no eyes on her and no one's expectations to navigate. She thought about the shape of what she was going to do. The specifics were still loose, still forming, but the core of it was clear now, in a way it hadn't been 6 weeks ago, hadn't been perhaps for years. She had work that she was genuinely good at. She had a place to do it from. She had something to go back to the town with that was not the woman they'd watched walk down the aisle in the beautiful dress. She was something else now. Not entirely different. Still herself, still the same hands and the same stubborn practicality and the same awareness of how the world had always looked at her. But standing on something. That was what her mother had said. Standing on something solid. She thought that was about right. The night was cooling down the way the frontier night did, quickly and completely, and she would go in soon and look over the orders for the week, and tomorrow the work would start again at first light. But for now she sat on the porch and looked at the sky and let herself want things. Let herself hold the plan in her hands without breaking it. And the land was dark and large and indifferent around her, the way the land always was, and it was enough. It was more than enough. She went back on a Wednesday. She chose Wednesday deliberately. Not a market day, not a Sunday, none of the days when Red Hollow gathered itself into a collective social event and the streets filled with people who had time to stand and watch things. Wednesday was a working day, and working people had things to do, and she had found, in the past weeks, that she preferred the company of people who had things to do over the company of people who were primarily watching. Wyatt drove her in. She hadn't asked him to, had in fact said the night before that she could manage on her own, that it wasn't a long road and the weather was holding. He'd listened to this, finished his coffee, and said that he had supplies to pick up from the general store anyway, and that it was on the way. This was either true or a piece of practical kindness disguised as logistics, and she decided it didn't matter which because the result was the same, and she was learning to accept useful things without spending too much time examining them. The road into Red Hollow looked the same as it always had. Of course it did. The hills gave way to the flat land. The flat land gave way to the first scattered outbuildings. The outbuildings resolved into the town's main street with its particular arrangement of storefronts, and the water trough in front of the post office, and the smell of horses and sawdust, and the faint underlying sweetness that she'd always associated with the town, and couldn't have named the source of if she tried. Everything was exactly where it had always been. She felt coming into it like someone returning from a country where different rules applied. You want me to come in with you? Wyatt asked. No, she said. And then, because she understood what he was offering, thank you. He nodded and drove the wagon to the far end of the street where the general store sat, and she got down with her bag and stood on the boardwalk of Red Hollow for the first time in 7 weeks. The first person to see her was Ed Simmons, who ran the hardware, and whose face did a complicated thing when he registered who she was. A rapid sequence of recognition, something close to surprise, and then a studied neutrality that was its own kind of expression. He nodded. She nodded back. He went into his store. The second person was Georgia Presley, and this was less fortunate in terms of timing, though she'd known Georgia was in town somewhere because she'd seen her buggy tied up outside the milliner's. Georgia was coming out of the milliner's when Mabel reached that part of the boardwalk. She stopped. Her eyes moved over Mabel, the work clothes that Mabel had altered to fit properly, the boots she'd resoled herself, the way she was standing, which was not, she realized, the way she used to stand in this town. And Georgia's expression arranged itself into the particular configuration of a woman who has been caught without a prepared response. "Mabel," she said. "Georgia." A pause that had weather in it. "You're back," Georgia said. "Passing through today," Mabel said. "I have business to take care of." "Business?" Georgia said the word carefully, as though testing its weight. "Yes." Mabel looked at her steadily. She was not performing steadiness. That was the thing she noticed, standing there on the boardwalk outside the milliner's with Georgia Presley's eyes on her. She was actually steady. Whatever had happened in those 7 weeks on the ranch, the work and the quiet and the nightly conversations on the porch, and the calf that found its feet, and the fence posts and the dawn mornings in the garden, something had changed in what she was standing on, and it held her differently. "I'll see you around, Georgia." She kept walking. Behind her, she heard Georgia say something to someone. There was apparently a someone just inside the milliner's door, and then a murmured response, and she felt the familiar prickling awareness of being discussed. She kept walking. It was there, but it didn't stop her, which was new, or not entirely new. She'd always been able to keep walking, always managed the front of it. But before there'd been something that twisted underneath the management. Today the twist was smaller. Still there, but smaller. She had a meeting with Martin Bray, who ran the property rentals in Red Hollow, and the 2 other small towns within a day's ride. She'd written to him from the ranch 3 weeks ago, a letter she'd drafted 4 times before she sent it. She'd been specific in the letter, practical, clear, the way she was when she wanted to be taken seriously and understood that vague requests produced vague responses. She had a business proposition. She was looking for a commercial space, small, in a location with foot traffic. She could pay 2 months in advance from the sewing work already in hand. She wanted to discuss terms. Martin Bray's reply had been brief and not exactly warm. He was a man who kept his correspondence functional, but he'd named a time to meet, which was what she needed. His office was above the feed merchants, which meant climbing an exterior staircase past the store that had belonged to Thomas Hale's father, which now had a nephew running it, or so she'd heard. She didn't look in the window. She went up the stairs and knocked. Martin Bray was in his 50s, a compact man with a gray beard he kept trimmed with military precision, and the manner of someone who had spent a career making decisions about property and had arrived at a settled conviction that property was more reliable than people. He stood when she came in, which she noted, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Bray? Thank you for seeing me. I received your letter." He had it on his desk. She could see it, her own handwriting, some notes in pencil in the margin. "You're looking for a commercial space." "Yes, small. I don't need more than a room to start. Good light would help, ground floor if possible, for the foot traffic." She'd thought through what she was going to say on the road in. "I do sewing work. Alterations, repair, made-to-order garments. I currently have more work than I can manage out of a residential space, and I have the customer base already established to support a proper location." He looked at her over his desk with the assessing expression of a man who dealt in facts. "I know who you are," he said. "Not unkindly, just stating it." "I know you do." "There's been some talk." "I imagine there has." She kept her voice even. "I'm not here to discuss that. I'm here to discuss space and terms." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense he was recalibrating slightly. She didn't know exactly what he'd been expecting, but she suspected it wasn't this. A woman who'd been publicly abandoned at the altar, turning up 7 weeks later to discuss commercial real estate with the directness of a cattle broker. "I have a space," he said, "on Cutter Street. It was a small notions shop. Woman ran it for 12 years, retired last spring. Ground floor, front window, reasonable square footage for what you're describing." He named a price. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. And she'd been prepared for this. She countered with a number that was also fair and had the logic of the sewing work behind it, which she explained briefly and specifically. He listened. He made a note. They settled on a number between the two. She paid the first month then and there from the folded bills in her coat pocket. "One thing," he said as she was standing to leave. She waited. "The talk is going to follow you into that space," he said. Not a warning exactly. More like information. "I've been in this town 30 years. I know how it goes." "I know how it goes too," she said. "I've lived here my whole life." Just wanted to say it plainly. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it, actually. Plain was what she could work with. She walked to Cutter Street and stood in front of the space. It was a narrow storefront wedged between a cobbler's and the dry goods annex. The front window was not large, but it faced east and the morning light would come through it directly, which was what she needed. The interior, when she got the key from Bray's man and let herself in, was dusty but sound. Wooden floors, decent walls, a workroom in the back that had a second window and better ceiling height than she'd hoped for. The Notions woman had left her shelving fixtures, which Mabel stood and looked at for a long time. She was standing in a room that was hers, that she was renting, with money she'd earned by her own skill, in a town that was going to have a great deal to say about this. She stood there for a while. Not long. She didn't need long. She locked the door and went back to find Wyatt. The shop opened 3 weeks later. The sign was simple. She'd painted it herself, white letters on a dark green ground. The green being a color she chose because she liked it, and because she was done making choices based entirely on what other people would think, cross sewing works. Under it, in smaller letters, alterations, repairs, custom work. Inquire within. The first week was quiet, in the way that first weeks often were, not empty, but careful. People came to the window more than they came in the door. She could see them from her work table, which she'd positioned deliberately within sightline of the front window, not because she wanted to be watched, but because the natural light was better there. She saw people slow down, pause, move on, sometimes double back and pause again. The work she already had gave her plenty to do. The orders that had accumulated from the ranch were more than enough to keep her hands busy, while the town made up its mind about her. She worked, and she waited, and she didn't particularly let on that she was doing either. The first proper walk-in customer was not who she expected. It was Ida Coleman. Ida Coleman was 73 years old, had lived in Red Hollow since before most of the current residents were born, and was the woman who'd said, "poor thing" in the church pew 7 weeks ago with carrying clarity. She came in on a Thursday morning, moving carefully but without the apology of very old people who've been made to feel they're in the way, and she looked around the shop with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection. Mabel set down her work. "Mrs. Coleman, I heard you'd opened," Ida said, still looking around. "I wanted to see for myself." "And?" Ida looked at her then. A direct, slightly unnerving look that Mabel suspected had been unnerving people for the better part of 7 decades. "You've got a good space," she said, "more organized than I expected." Mabel was quiet, waiting to see where this was going. Ida moved to the counter. She was carrying a garment bag which she set down and opened. Inside was a coat, a very good coat. Mabel could see that immediately, the kind of quality that didn't often appear in a town like Red Hollow. Wool, fine cut, probably 20 years old by the style, and beautifully maintained except for the lining, which had given out entirely. "It was my daughter's," Ida said. "She lives in St. Louis now. She sent it back when the lining went. Thought maybe someone could fix it. I've had it sitting in a box for 8 months. Mabel lifted the coat carefully. The outer fabric was in remarkable condition, the wool firm and clean, the seams sound. The lining had simply worn through at the stress points, the natural result of 2 decades of use. "New lining," she said. "I'd need to source the silk, which will take a week or 2. But the coat itself is in good shape. Can it be done?" "Yes." She looked up. "I'll need her measurements if the fit should change, or if the original fit is what you want, I can work from the coat itself." "The original fit," Ida said. She was happy with it. Mabel nodded, wrote down what she needed, named a price that was fair for the work involved, and watched Ida Coleman consider it with the focused attention of a woman who had been assessing value for 73 years and was not going to start being imprecise about it now. "That's reasonable," Ida said. "It's accurate," Mabel said. Something shifted in Ida's face. Not quite a smile, more like a recalibration, a slight revision to whatever she'd come in expecting to find. She nodded. She left. Mabel stood in the quiet of the shop and let out a breath. It was not redemption. It was not even particularly dramatic. It was an old woman bringing in a coat and work agreed upon, and the ordinary beginning of something. She sat back down and picked up her needle. The trouble when it came from a direction she'd half anticipated and still wasn't quite prepared for. It came in the form of Dorothy Fenwick. Dorothy Fenwick was 42, the wife of Clarence Fenwick, who sat on the town's informal commerce board, and was one of those men who occupied a kind of ambient authority in small communities, not elected to anything formal, not particularly distinguished in any specific way, but present at every significant decision and generally understood to represent the opinion of certain long-established families. Dorothy had the particular manner of a woman who derived her status from her husband's, and had consequently become very careful about anything that might be perceived as reflecting on it. She came into the shop on a Friday, her second week open. Came in with a companion, Rosalie Marsh, who was Lena Marsh's mother and therefore connected to the same web of families that Dorothy ran in. Mabel heard the bell above the door and came out from the back. "Mrs. Fenwick," she said, "Mrs. Marsh." Dorothy's eyes moved around the shop with an expression that was not quite hostility. It was more like the purposeful assessment of someone looking for a specific problem and confident they'd find one. "I didn't know you were opening a commercial establishment," she said. "I wrote to Mr. Bray 3 weeks before the opening. I imagine it wasn't a secret." "No, but—" Dorothy paused. "I suppose I'm surprised you chose to come back to town at all, given—" She left the given floating in the air with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Everything." "Given everything," Mabel said, "I find I have work to do. Is there something I can help you with today?" "I came to see for myself," Dorothy said, in a tone that made clear she wasn't referring to the quality of the merchandise. "Well," Mabel said, "now you have." Dorothy's companion, Rosalie, was looking at the near wall where Mabel had hung a few samples. A collar she'd made, a repaired coat, a skirt that a customer had agreed to let her display. She was looking at the collar with the involuntary attention of someone who can't help responding to quality work even when they'd intended to come in with a different agenda. "That collar," Rosalie said. "Handmade," Mabel said. "Point lace edging. I can do it to order if you're interested." Rosalie opened her mouth. Dorothy touched her arm, the briefest motion, and Rosalie closed it again. "Mabel," Dorothy said, and she dropped the Miss Cross with a deliberateness that was its own kind of boundary setting. "I'll say this clearly, because I think you'd prefer that. There are people in this town who think it's not appropriate for you to be operating here the way you are, given your situation, your—" She paused, selecting arrangement. "I'm renting a commercial space and running a sewing business," Mabel said. "That's the arrangement. With Wyatt Granger. I work from Mr. Granger's ranch and I run a business in town. If that's what concerns people, I'd encourage them to come speak with me directly." Dorothy looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating in real time, looking for the angle and not quite finding it. "People talk," she said. "People do," Mabel agreed. "And I find that what I do is generally more interesting to me than what people say about it. Is there anything I can help you with today, Mrs. Fenwick? I have a customer coming at 11. She didn't have a customer coming at 11. But Dorothy Fenwick didn't know that, and the more important thing was the tone. Not rude, not aggressive, not the thin-voiced apology she might have produced a year ago. Just clear. The kind of clear that said, "I'm not asking you to think well of me, but I'm also not going to stand here and be looked at." Dorothy left. Rosalie followed with one more look at the collar on the wall that she clearly found it an effort to leave behind. When the bell stopped ringing above the door, Mabel stood in the silence of the shop. Her hands were entirely steady. The talk about the shop was one category of problem. The talk about Wyatt was another. She'd expected both. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the way they'd intersect, the way the town's discomfort with her independence would keep circling back to him, as though her choices required a male explanation to make sense, as though the presence of Wyatt Granger in the situation was the only legible part of it, and everything else, the work, the rental, the sign on Cutter Street, the early mornings in the kitchen garden, and the skills she'd been honing for 26 years, was somehow secondary context. She heard from Cobb, in his indirect way, that there were people approaching Wyatt, men, mostly, from around town and the neighboring ranches. The kind of conversations that happened over fences and in the feed store, the ambient social pressure that communities applied when they felt a norm was being tested and wanted to remind people that norms existed. She heard this, and she thought about it, and one evening back at the ranch she brought it up directly. "People are talking to you," she said. They were on the porch, the night cooling down around them, and she'd been carrying the question all day, waiting for the right moment and then deciding there was no right moment, so she might as well say it. He didn't act surprised. Some. Saying what? He was quiet for a moment. Saying I should think carefully about my reputation, about what it looks like. He paused. Tom Garrett said it was a charity case, and I should know when I'd done enough. The words landed with the particular dull thud of something you've expected, but that still, when it arrives, finds the unguarded spot. And what did you say? She asked. I said Tom Garrett's opinion of my choices wasn't something I'd asked for, and that if he had concerns about the management of my property, he could put them in writing, and I'd read them when I had time. He was quiet for a moment. He didn't have further comments. She let that sit. It might get worse, she said, if the business does well. Some people don't like, she chose the word carefully, revision, when they've already decided what something is. I know. It might affect what people will and won't do with you, business-wise. He turned his cup in his hands. You keep preparing me for consequences, he said, like I haven't been living in this town longer than you have. I'm trying to be fair to you. I know you are. He was quiet for a moment, and there was something in his voice, a quality she'd learned over these weeks to pay attention to, the shift when he was being genuinely specific about something. What would help me feel that you're being fair to me is if you'd stop treating my choices like something I need to be protected from. I made them with my eyes open. She looked at him. I know, she said. I know you did. They sat with that for a while. It wasn't entirely comfortable, and neither of them moved to make it comfortable. And that was also, she thought, something she'd learned to appreciate. That discomfort didn't have to be managed away. It could just be there while two people sat with it. Yet, what turned things, not completely, not overnight, but noticeably, in the incremental way things actually turned in real communities, was the autumn. Autumn brought a particular need. It brought the awareness that winter was coming and that winter clothing needed attention. Coats that had been in storage for 8 months, boots that needed resoling, the practical reckoning that came when the temperature dropped and you pulled out last year's things, and discovered what time and use had done to them. It also brought 2 settlements over, the news that a woman named Frances Alderman had been trying for 3 seasons to get a coat made to fit her. Frances was a large woman, broader than Mabel, taller, with the particular difficulty that tall, large women had with ready-made or even custom clothing from people who'd learned their craft on the standard range of bodies. She'd been ordering from catalogs and being disappointed, and she'd been to 2 seamstresses in the region, both of whom had told her, with various degrees of tact and tactlessness, that her measurements made the work complicated. She came to Mabel's shop on a Thursday in late September, drove 2 hours to get there, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had been disappointed enough times that she wasn't investing hope she couldn't afford to lose. Mabel looked at her, at the coat she'd brought, the most recent failed catalog purchase, a thing that fit across the shoulders but pulled badly at the hip and had the wrong depth in the back for her posture. At the way Frances was standing, a very slight protective curl forward that was the body language of someone who'd been told, in various ways, that their body was an inconvenient thing. Come in, Mabel said. Let me take your measurements. The last person who took my measurements said the numbers weren't right, Frances said. She said it flatly, without drama, just as information. Then whoever took them didn't know what they were looking at, Mabel said. Numbers are just numbers. What matters is what you do with them. Frances came in. The measurements took 20 minutes. They were not, in fact, complicated. They were specific, which was different. Mabel took 12 measurements where most people took 6, noting things that mattered for the actual construction of a garment, not just the circumference, but the distribution, the relationship between shoulder width and upper arm, the particular angle of Frances's posture that would affect where the back seam needed to sit. She wrote everything down in the small notebook she kept for orders, and she did not make a face or a sound or any of the micro-expressions that people in Frances's position learned over years to watch for. What do you want? Mabel asked when the measurements were done. Frances blinked. What do you mean? In a coat. What do you actually want? Practical or also... She gestured at the walls, at the samples, at the point-lace collar that Rosalie Marsh had looked at and regretted leaving, some of the other things. Frances looked at her for a moment, then she said quietly, I'd like it to be nice. I'd like it to be something I'm glad to put on. All right, Mabel said. I can do that. She drafted the pattern that evening at the ranch. Stayed up later than she should have, working by the lamp in the East Room, because the problem of it interested her. The genuine technical problem of building a garment for a specific body rather than a hypothetical one. She redid the back panel twice before she had it right. She chose the fabric from what she could source locally, and what she couldn't source locally, she ordered from the regional supplier she'd been building a relationship with over the past months. The coat took 3 weeks. She told Frances 4, so she had a week to look at it carefully, to find the places that were merely good and make them actually right. When Frances came to pick it up and Mabel helped her into it, the difference was immediate and visible. Not a transformation. Frances was exactly who she'd been when she walked in 3 weeks ago. But the coat fit her in the way that good clothes fit, like it had been made for the person wearing it, which it had. Frances stood in front of the small mirror Mabel had mounted on the workroom wall and looked at herself. She was quiet for a moment. "This is the first coat I've ever had that fits," she said. Mabel heard the thing underneath it, the years of the thing, the accumulated small defeats of it, and she didn't remark on it because remarking would have made it precious when it should just be normal, a woman getting a coat that fit, as though that were the ordinary thing it should always have been. "Good," she said. "It'll need taking in after wash if you put on or lose any weight. Bring it back and I'll adjust it." Frances paid. She shook Mabel's hand before she left, a firm, deliberate handshake, the kind that meant something. Frances talked about the coat. Of course she did. She talked about it to the women in her settlement and the women at the market, and to her sister-in-law who lived another settlement over. She talked about it in the specific, detailed way that people talk about things that exceeded their expectations in a domain where their expectations had been low for a long time. She said Mabel Cross in Red Hollow. She said she can fit anyone. She said go. Some of them went. The day Dorothy Fenwick came back was a Tuesday in October. Mabel was alone in the shop, working on alterations for a man's suit, a complicated job, a wedding suit that needed to be taken in significantly and restructured at the shoulders. She heard the bell and came to the front. Dorothy Fenwick stood at the counter with an expression that was doing several things at once. She was a woman who prided herself on certain kinds of control, and the control was present, but underneath it something else was working that it had to work around. "I need a dress," she said. Mabel waited. "For my daughter's engagement dinner," Dorothy continued. "In November. I'd want something—" She paused, and Mabel understood the pause, understood the effort it cost, appropriate for the occasion, not the usual. She said this last part more quietly. "What's the usual?" Mabel asked. "The catalog things." Dorothy's hands were on the counter. She was looking at the surface of it rather than at Mabel. "They're never quite right. The sleeves are always wrong." "I can fix the sleeves," Mabel said. Dorothy looked up. "I can fix whatever's wrong," Mabel said. "That's what I do." A long moment. The shop was quiet enough that Mabel could hear the sounds from the street. A wagon going past, 2 men talking outside the cobbler's next door. "I said some things," Dorothy said. "Not an apology exactly. More like an inventory being taken. In the early weeks." "You said what you thought," Mabel said. "I don't have a quarrel with that. Rosalie has been talking about that collar since the day we came in." Something shifted in Dorothy's face. The effort of the control easing slightly, a woman emerging from behind the position she'd taken. "She said she should have ordered it when she had the chance." "She still can," Mabel said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you take my measurements?" Mabel got her notebook. She took Dorothy Fenwick's measurements with the same care she gave every customer. 12 measurements, the same notation, the same attention to the specific and individual body in front of her, rather than the body she might have expected or preferred. And Dorothy Fenwick, who had come into this shop 7 weeks ago as something close to an adversary, and was now standing with her arms out while Mabel measured her sleeve length, said nothing for a while. Then she said without looking down, "You've done well. With the shop." "Thank you," Mabel said. She wrote down the sleeve length, moved to the next measurement. "Better than people expected," Dorothy said. "Better than I expected," Mabel said, which was not entirely true but was close enough, and it had the effect of making Dorothy Fenwick almost smile, which was close enough to that. The night before the letter arrived, Mabel sat on the ranch porch and thought about the shape of things. It was October, and the air had the first real edge of cold in it, the kind that said the season was making up its mind. The hills were going to rust and brown at the edges, the cottonwoods along the creek turning in patches. The sky was the deep, clear blue of a good autumn, and the first stars were coming out above the eastern ridge. She thought about the shop and the orders she had for November and the supplies she needed to order by end of the week. She thought about Francis Alderman's coat and Ida Coleman's lining and the engagement dress for Dorothy Fenwick's daughter that she was already beginning to plan in the back of her mind. She thought about what she might need if the business grew. Not if, she corrected herself, because the conditional was a habit of her old way of thinking, that flinch away from wanting things. When it grew, she thought about Wyatt, who was inside reading, who had driven her into town twice a week for 2 months, and picked her up without complaint, and who had said last week that the East Room would have better light if she added a second lamp and then appeared the next morning with a second lamp, having apparently gone and gotten it without announcement. She thought about what she was and what she was becoming, and how different those two things felt from what she'd been standing on 7 weeks ago at that altar in the beautiful dress. She heard the door open behind her. Wyatt came out and sat in the other chair. He had his coffee. He said nothing for a while, which was normal, and she said nothing for a while, which was also normal, and the stars came out over the ridge in their usual extravagant quantity. "There's a letter from Bray," she said eventually. She'd been carrying it in her pocket all afternoon. About the space next door to the shop. The cobbler's apparently moving to a bigger space on Main. The room would be available. He was quiet. "It's twice what I'm paying now," she said. "For twice the space." He turned his coffee cup. "Can you support it?" She thought about those numbers, about the orders for November and the 2 new customers from Francis Alderman's settlement who'd come in last week, and the dress for Dorothy Fenwick's daughter. "Not yet," she said. "By spring. Maybe by spring." He nodded, said nothing else about it. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. The edge in the air sharpened slightly, and she pulled her coat collar up. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the day you drove me away from the church. What you were thinking." "I was thinking you needed somewhere to go," he said. "That's all?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I was thinking," he said slowly, like a man being accurate with something he might otherwise simplify, "that you looked like someone who was used to making herself smaller than she was, and that didn't seem like it should be permanent." She was quiet. The stars were doing their enormous thing. A coyote called from the direction of the lower pasture. A long, conversational sound, and then silence. "It's not," she said, "permanent." "No," he said, "I can see that." She looked out at the dark hills, at the land she'd been learning to read for 2 months now, at the sky above the ridge where she'd watched the autumn coming in patches of color. The letter was in her pocket. The shop was on Cutter Street. The second lamp was in the East Room. She was standing on something solid, and it was holding. The second lamp made a difference she hadn't anticipated, not just practically, though it did help. The East Room twice as usable in the evenings now, the corners where the first lamp didn't reach properly, finally visible enough to work in. But in some way she couldn't have explained cleanly to anyone who asked. The lamp was there because Wyatt had noticed and done something about it, without being asked, without making a production of the noticing. It was such a small thing. She kept finding herself aware of it anyway. She'd been on the ranch 4 months now. The counting was no longer deliberate. She wasn't marking days the way she had in the early weeks, when she'd been acutely conscious of the temporary nature of the arrangement and had kept herself from settling too fully into anything. At some point, the counting had just stopped, the way it did when somewhere shifted from a place you were staying to a place you were. The ranch had its winter face on now. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare, the hills gray-brown and close-looking under the low November sky, the mornings dark until well past 6. The work adjusted for it. There was less of the sprawling outdoor labor that had defined the summer and early fall, more indoor work, the mending and maintenance that accumulated through the warmer months and got addressed when the weather made outside work impossible. Wyatt repaired tack and equipment with the patient focus of a man who had learned to treat the slower season as a form of preparation rather than a gap in the real business. Mabel worked on the shop orders in the evenings and the weekend, and they moved around each other in the house with the easy efficiency of people who'd stopped thinking consciously about how to share space. The shop on Cutter Street had developed its own rhythm too. She went in Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and sometimes Monday if there was a delivery or a fitting that couldn't wait. The rest of the week she worked from the ranch, cutting and stitching the pieces that didn't require the customer present, the work she could do with just the measurements and her notebook and the growing library of patterns she'd been accumulating in a wooden box under the East Room work table. What she hadn't expected about the business, genuinely hadn't anticipated was how much of it was listening. Not the technical listening of measurements and specifications, though that was part of it, but the other kind. She'd noticed it first with Francis Alderman and then seen it repeat with enough customers that she'd stopped thinking of it as a coincidence. Women came in to have something made or mended, and they often ended up saying more than the occasion seemed to require. They said what they actually wanted, not just what they thought was available. They said things about their bodies that they'd apparently been keeping to themselves for a long time. Not complaints exactly, more like the careful unburdening of someone who'd finally found a context in which those words made sense. A woman who was 8 months into a difficult pregnancy and wanted a coat that she could actually wear, rather than throwing something over her shoulders and hoping for the best. A woman whose left shoulder sat higher than her right because of an old injury and who had spent years selecting clothes that concealed this rather than worked with it, and who was startled when Mabel noted it and said, "We can build around that. It doesn't need to be hidden." A woman who was 61 years old and still dressed as though she were apologizing for existing past a certain age, who came in for a practical alteration and left with a commission for a dress that was, according to her own uncertain half-voiced specification, something she actually wanted to wear. Mabel did not think of herself as doing something larger than sewing. She was clear-eyed enough about the nature of the work to know that she made clothes, not miracles. But she also understood increasingly that clothes were not neutral, that what you put on your body was a continuous negotiation with the world about what you were and how much space you were allowed to take up in it. She'd been in that negotiation her whole life. She knew what it felt like when the terms were unfair. So she listened. She took the extra time. She asked the question that got past the practical request to the actual one. It added time to the fittings, added complexity to the work. She charged for that complexity because she'd learned, more quickly than she'd expected, that charging fairly was a form of respect both directions, that customers who paid a fair price valued the work differently than customers who felt they were getting something at the expense of the person providing it. The shop was not profitable in the way that large operations were profitable, but it was sustaining and it was growing, and that felt like enough. Geschämt. The letter from Martin Bray about the adjacent space sat in her coat pocket through November. She took it out occasionally, read it again, put it back. The number she'd given Wyatt on the porch had been honest. She couldn't support the expansion yet. By spring was the realistic timeline, and she'd learned in the past months that she had a better instinct than she'd thought for what was realistic. She wasn't going to stretch past what she could actually hold. She'd seen what happened when you reached for more than the ground underneath you could support, and she'd seen it from enough angles to have developed a healthy respect for the principle. So she kept the letter, and she kept the schedule, and she kept her attention on the work that was in front of her, which was how she'd always operated best. Not by planning 10 steps ahead and losing sight of the step underfoot, but by doing the next thing as well as it could be done, and trusting that the next thing after that would become clear. What did become clear, in November, was that Wyatt's ranch had a problem she hadn't known about. She found out the way she often found out things on the frontier, sideways, through someone else's conversation, through the information that traveled the secondary channels, because the primary channels were occupied with more deliberate forms of communication. Cobb mentioned it, which was by now a familiar pattern. He came to return a borrowed post driver and stayed, as Cobb tended to do, a little longer than the errand required, sitting on the fence at the edge of the near pasture with the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who had decided information needed to move. "Heard something at the feed store," he said. He'd been there to pick up supplies for his employer, the Taggart spread to the east. "About this land." Mabel was working the far fence of the near pasture, checking the tension on the wire after the recent freeze had done its predictable damage to the posts. She kept working and let him continue. "Peterson's been talking," Cobb said. "Dale Peterson. He's been saying that there's a title issue. With the north section, the 40 acres up past the ridge." He paused. "He's saying the original homestead claim wasn't properly filed, that the surveying records have a gap, and that there might be a legal question about who actually owns it." Mabel stopped working. "What kind of legal question?" she asked. "The kind where Peterson ends up owning it, if he can get a judge to look at it his way." Cobb looked uncomfortable. "He's been acquiring land up this way for the past 2 years. That north section sits between his holdings on the east and the Garrett parcel on the west. If he can get it..." He didn't finish this. "He'd control the water access to the upper pasture," Mabel said. Cobb looked at her. "You know the layout?" "I've been walking it for 4 months." She went straight to the house and found Wyatt in the barn, which was where he was most afternoons. She told him what Cobb had said, plainly, and in the order she'd heard it, and watched his face while she did. His face did not do very much. This was one of his qualities that she'd learned to read carefully. The less his face moved, the more significant the information was, because he controlled his expressions the way he controlled most things, from a place of genuine self-possession rather than performance. He was quiet for a long time. "I know about the surveying records," he said finally. She waited. "When I filed the original claim, the county surveyor made an error in the north parcel notation. I found it 3 years later when I was checking the deed records for a boundary question with Garrett to the west. I had it corrected, or I believed I had it corrected. The clerk at the county office said the amendment had been filed." "But," she said. "But I don't have documentation of the filing," he said. "Just the clerk's word. And the clerk retired 2 years ago." She looked at him. "Who's the clerk now?" "Man named Shelby Poole." He said the name with the neutral tone of someone describing terrain. "He came into his position about 6 months before Peterson started acquiring land in this area." The barn was quiet. One of the horses moved in its stall, a slow, restless shift. "That's not a coincidence," she said. "No," he said. "Probably not." She was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Then she said, "The original surveying notes from when you filed the claim. Do you have them?" "Somewhere. In the house. There's a box of papers. The original claim, the correspondence with the county office, the deed transfers." He paused. "I haven't looked at them in years." "We need to find them," she said. "Tonight." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she'd learned to identify as him adjusting to the pace of something. He was not a slow thinker, but he was a deliberate one, and she was moving faster than his natural speed right now. "All right," he said. "Tonight." The box was in the back room, buried under 2 years of accumulated practical miscellany, the kind of accumulation that happened in working households where there was always something more immediate than filing. Mabel and Wyatt spent 2 hours going through it at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp pulled close, sorting through the papers with the careful attention of people looking for something specific in a pile of everything. She found the original claim documentation first. The date, the parcel description, the survey notation, and there, in the north parcel description, the error that the surveyor had made and that Wyatt had taken to the county office to have corrected. "Here," she said, spreading the papers out. "This is the original. This is what was filed." He leaned over and looked at it. "And the correction?" She went through the rest of the box systematically, making 2 piles, documents that related to the north parcel, everything else. The correction documentation wasn't there. What was there was a letter from the county office dated almost 3 years ago, saying that the amendment request had been received and was under review. Nothing after that. "Under review," she said, "for 3 years. I assumed it had been processed," he said. He said it without defensiveness, just the flat admission of a man acknowledging that he'd made an assumption that had cost him. "Who do we talk to?" she asked. "Beyond the county clerk." "There's a land attorney in Millbrook, 60 miles east." He paused. "I used him for the deed transfer when I acquired the eastern section, 5 years ago. He knows the county records." "Then we need to go to Millbrook." He was quiet. "Wyatt," she kept her voice even, "if Peterson is moving on this, he's not going to wait until you have everything in order. He's counting on you not moving first." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not opening exactly, more like a layer of the deliberate control moving aside to show what was underneath it. "I know," he said. "I know. When can we go?" "I can go next week." "We can go next week," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looked down at the papers spread across the kitchen table. "You don't have to," he started. "I'm going," she said. "I know these documents now. I've been looking at them for 2 hours." She began gathering them back into order, the relevant ones separated from the rest. "Also, I know when someone needs a second pair of eyes on something, and you're a man who is very good at a great many things and who would benefit from not doing this one alone." He didn't argue with that. She hadn't expected him to. They went to Millbrook on a Tuesday. The drive was 4 hours each way, the road crossing 3 different county territories before it reached the small city that served as the regional legal and commercial center for this part of the frontier. Mabel had been to Millbrook twice before, once as a child, once for a brief catalog buying trip that had resulted in one of the unsuccessful purchases she'd since thought of as the case for custom work over ready-made. The attorney's name was Richard Cathcart, and he was the kind of man whose office told you what to expect from him before he said a word: organized, dense with files and books, the accumulated documentation of a working legal practice. He received them with the brisk efficiency of someone who valued time, looked at the papers they'd brought, and asked a series of specific questions that told Mabel he understood the situation faster than she'd hoped, but also that he took it seriously. "The gap in the record is the issue," he said. He was looking at the original claim documents and the letter from the county office. "This letter acknowledges receipt bo feet of your amendment request. But if the amendment was never formally processed and recorded, Peterson's attorneys can argue that the original erroneous survey is the legally operative document." "Which would give him the basis for a claim," Wyatt said. "It would give him the basis for a challenge," Cathcart said. "Not necessarily a winning one, but enough to create legal uncertainty. And legal uncertainty in property disputes is often enough." He looked at them over the papers. "The original surveyor, do you know where he is?" "Retired," Wyatt said. "Left the county. I don't know where." "The county clerk who received your amendment request retired," Wyatt said, "before Shelby Poole took the position." Cathcart made a note. "What about neighbors who can attest to your use and occupation of the north parcel?" Continuous occupation is a form of legal establishment, even where documentation is unclear. Mabel thought about Cobb, about the Taggart family to the east, about old Marcus Webb, whose property line touched Wyatt's northern boundary, who had been in this county since before Wyatt had filed his original claim and who had watched Wyatt work this land for 12 years. "Yes," she said, "there are neighbors." Cathcart looked at her. She'd been largely quiet through the meeting, listening, taking her own notes in the small book she'd carried everywhere since the shop opened. "You're familiar with the land?" "I've been on it for 4 months," she said. "I can tell you the fence lines, the water access points, the physical characteristics of the north parcel. If you need someone who can describe the property in detail, I can do that. You're not a property holder yourself." "I'm a witness," she said, "to occupation and use. That's what you're looking for." He looked at her for a moment. "It is," he said. He made another note. "All right, here's what I need you to do." He gave them a list. It was specific and practical and contained several items that Mabel had already been thinking about, which she found reassuring. He would file for a formal review of the amendment records at the county office. He would request documentation of all correspondence related to the parcel from the past 3 years. He would write to the county commissioner directly, bypassing Shelby Poole, which was something he could do from Millbrook without going through the local channels that Peterson appeared to have access to. "This won't be fast," he said. "Legal review of property records takes months, sometimes longer." "How long does Peterson have before he can file a formal challenge?" Mabel asked. Cathcart looked at her again with the expression of someone adjusting their expectations of who they were talking to. "If he's been building the case for 2 years, he likely feels he's close. My estimate is he files before the spring land season, March, possibly April." "We have 5 months," she said. 4, to be safe," Cathcart said. She wrote that down. She wrote down everything he said. On the road back to Red Hollow, the wagon moving through the long flat stretches between the hills, Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Not the comfortable quiet of the porch evenings. A different kind. The kind that had work in it. "You knew about the land issues before today," she said. Not an accusation. Just an observation. He took a moment. "I knew there was a risk," he said. "I thought it was manageable. I thought—" He paused. "I thought I had more time." "Why didn't you say anything?" Another pause. "Because you had enough to manage," he said. "The shop, the move back to town, all of it. I didn't want to—" "To what?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. The horse kept its pace on the road, indifferent to the conversation. "I didn't want you to feel like you were walking into someone else's problems," he said finally. "When you already had Wyatt." She said his name with the directness that she'd gotten better at over the past months. The precision of saying a thing and meaning it. "I have been on that land for 4 months. I have fixed the fences and kept the garden and helped with the calving, and I know the boundary lines well enough to describe them to a lawyer. When does it become my problem too?" He was quiet. "That's not meant to be. It's not a claim," she said. "I'm not saying I own any part of it. I'm saying that it matters to me what happens to it. That's different." She watched his hands on the reins. He had good hands. She'd noticed this early on, in the way you notice things about people you worked alongside. Capable and practical, and not particularly gentle-looking, but careful with things when they needed care. "I'm not used to it," he said. Finally. Quietly. To what? To it mattering to someone else. He didn't look at her when he said it. His eyes were on the road. "I've been on that land 12 years. Nobody else has had a stake in it." She let that sit. "I know," she said. The road wound between two low hills and came out onto the broader flat where the light stretched long and thin across the dry grass. The sky ahead was the pale gold of a late afternoon in early winter, the sun low on the western edge. She thought about what she was going to say, and then she said it, because she'd learned that holding things until the perfect moment often meant not saying them at all. "You drove me away from that church," she said. "You gave me a room and a fence line to fix, and you didn't make me explain myself. You got a second lamp for the east room without being asked." She looked at the road ahead. "It mattered to you what happened to me, even when it was not your problem." He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Then let me," she said. "Let me have a stake in it." Another long quiet. The horse moved on the road. The light went on changing. "All right," he said, low, careful. "All right," she said. They worked the problem through November and into December the way Mabel worked everything, methodically, with specific tasks allocated and tracked. The list Cathcart had given them treated as a project with deadlines, rather than an abstract legal process happening somewhere else. Wyatt wrote to Marcus Webb, who responded with a letter of characteristic brevity and unexpected usefulness. "I have been your neighbor 12 years, and in that time you have worked the North Parcel as your own continuous, and I have never known it to be otherwise." He would testify to this if required. Cobb, when approached, said he'd seen Wyatt work that parcel since before he'd started working for the Taggarts, which was 7 years. And yes, he'd say so in writing. He also mentioned, with the air of someone producing a gift they weren't sure would land, that his employer Jonas Taggart had had his own run-in with Peterson 3 years back. A grazing rights dispute that had been quietly resolved in a manner that Taggart had not been entirely satisfied with. Taggart might be interested to know there was a pattern. "Talk to Taggart," Mabel said to Cobb. "Tell him what's happening. Ask him if he'd be willing to add his knowledge to the record." "He might say no," Cobb said. "He might," she agreed. "That's why we ask." Taggart said yes. He said it with the contained anger of a man who had been waiting for a place to put something he'd been carrying for 3 years. He wrote a letter to Cathcart himself, detailing the nature of Peterson's approach to his own property dispute, and he sent copies to the county commissioner and to the district land office in the regional capital. Mabel wrote the letter to the district land office herself. She drafted it over 3 evenings, going through 4 versions before she had it right. Specific, documented, unemotional, the facts of the surveying error and the amendment request, and the 3-year gap in the processing record laid out in order with references to the documentation they'd attached. She showed the final version to Wyatt before sending it. He read it at the kitchen table, going through it carefully. "This is good," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "That matters more." He looked up at her. "Where did you learn to write like this?" She thought about it. "I wrote a great many letters over the years," she said. "You learn what works and what doesn't, when the letters actually need to accomplish something." She paused. "My father lost land once, when I was young. He wrote a great deal of letters about it, and most of them were too angry to be useful, and I remember watching and thinking, the anger's real, but it's not the part they need to hear." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. "What happened to your father's land?" he asked. "He lost it," she said simply. "Not because he was wrong, because he didn't have the documentation." He looked at her. "We have the documentation," she said. "Yes," he said. "We do." December brought its weather and its demands. The ranch in winter was not brutal. Not this year, at least, not yet. But it required a different kind of attentiveness. The monitoring of livestock and infrastructure against cold that was steady, if not catastrophic. Mabel kept her shop days but reduced her hours, the short winter light limiting what she could do in the Cutter Street space without running up lamp costs beyond what was reasonable. She did more of the work at the ranch, the cutting and stitching that she'd learned she preferred to do with the full morning light from the east window anyway. She and Wyatt had developed, by now, something that she would have been hard-pressed to describe precisely, but that she understood clearly. A partnership that was not defined by what it was called, because they hadn't called it anything. It had its own shape, the shared work and the shared problem and the shared evenings on the porch that had moved inside as the temperature dropped. The two of them at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them. Him with his book or his equipment work, and her with her sewing or her order book. The domestic quiet of it, the way she now automatically made 2 cups of coffee in the morning, the way he moved around her in the kitchen with the adjustment that came from knowing where someone would be. She had stopped waiting for it to end. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd done that, but she had. One evening in mid-December, Ida Coleman appeared at the ranch. This was not something Ida had done before. Mabel heard the buggy on the road and went to the window and saw the old woman driving herself, which Ida apparently did when she had something specific on her mind and didn't want the complication of whoever else might be available to drive her. Mabel met her at the door. Ida came in and declined tea with the practicality of someone who didn't have time for social framing. She sat at the kitchen table and she said, "I want to tell you something." Mabel sat down across from her. "I said something at the church," Ida said. "When Hale left, I said, poor thing." She said it precisely, the way she'd said it that day, and Mabel heard the echo of it across 5 months. "I've been thinking about it since you opened the shop." "Mrs. Coleman, I'm not apologizing," Ida said firmly. "I'm explaining, which is different." She folded her hands on the table with the composure of someone who had been having direct conversations for 7 decades and wasn't going to start softening them now. "When I said it, I meant it the ordinary way, the pity way. The way you say it when you see someone lose something." She paused. "What I've been thinking about since is that I didn't know what I was looking at." Mabel was quiet. "I've watched you these 4 months," Ida said. "In the shop, around town. What you're doing with those women, with Frances Alderman and the others. I know what people said about you when you were a girl. I know what they said when Hale left." She was direct with this, unflinching. "I said it too, some of it. Not the worst of it, but I didn't stop it either." "That was a long time ago," Mabel said. "Not so long." Ida's eyes were sharp and clear and not unkind. "My daughter's coat is the finest thing in her wardrobe. She wrote to tell me so." A pause. "And I wanted you to know that some of us are capable of looking at something again when the looking is warranted." Mabel held this. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without reservation. Ida nodded. She stood with the decisive economy of a woman who had delivered what she'd come to deliver. "Your ranch is in order," she said, looking around the kitchen with a landlady's assessment. "Better than I'd heard." "We work at it," Mabel said. "I can see that." Ida moved toward the door. "I'll be in on Thursday to pick up Dorothy's daughter's dress." "It'll be ready," Mabel said. Ida went out into the December evening, and Mabel stood in the doorway for a moment watching the buggy roll back down the road. Behind her, from the direction of the barn, she heard Wyatt's footsteps. He came around the corner and saw her standing in the doorway. "Ida Coleman," she said. "She came to tell me something." "Good or bad?" She thought about it. "Good," she said. "I think it was good." He came to stand beside her and they both looked at the road where the buggy was receding in the fading afternoon light. "Cathcart sent word," he said. "The district land office has opened a formal review of the amendment records. Peterson's attorneys were notified today." She was quiet for a moment. "So he knows we're moving," she said. "He knows." And now it's a question of who has the better documentation," Wyatt said. "Cathcart thinks we do. He thinks the Taggart letter was significant. It establishes pattern, not just error." She thought about the letter she'd spent 3 evenings writing, the 4 drafts, the choice to stay factual, to stay specific, to not let the anger she felt on Wyatt's behalf make the document less useful. "It was the right call," she said. "Going to Cathcart when we did." "Yes," he said. "It was." He was quiet for a moment. "That was you, pushing on that. I'd have sat with it longer." "I know." "I'm glad you didn't let me." She turned to look at him. His face in the winter evening light had the particular quality she'd gotten used to, the inhabitation, the genuine presence. "We'll get the land," she said. Not as a promise, because she wasn't one for promises she couldn't fully guarantee, but as a statement of what she believed, which felt like something solid enough to be worth saying. He looked at her for a long moment. "The East Room," he said. "Is it working for you? For the winter?" "Yes," she said. "I was thinking the south wall. There's a way to add another window. Better afternoon light. Would help in the short days. She looked at him, at the fact of what he'd just said, not offering it, not asking, just thinking about it as a thing that would be done for the use she was making of that room. That would help, she said. Her voice was level. She made it level. I'll look at it this week, he said. They stood in the doorway while the last of the afternoon light went from the road, and the cold came in around them, and neither of them moved to go back inside yet. The work was there. The problem was real and being addressed. The land was worth fighting for, and they were fighting for it. The shop was on Cutter Street, and the orders were in the book, and the east room had a second lamp and would have a south window when the weather allowed. She thought about the woman who'd walked down that aisle in the beautiful dress, who'd stood at the altar while 47 people watched a man decide she wasn't worth staying for, who'd said all right to a stranger's offer of a wagon ride and ended up somewhere she couldn't have planned or predicted. She was still that woman. She hadn't stopped being her. But she was also other things now. Things that had always been there but hadn't had room. Things that had needed space and work, and a land she could walk, and a problem she could help solve, and a man who got a second lamp for her room and was already thinking about the south window. All of it was hers. She was keeping it. The district land office sent its finding in February. The letter arrived on a Thursday, carried by the mail rider who came up the North Road twice a week, and Mabel found it on the kitchen table when she came in from the morning garden work. Wyatt had brought in the mail and left it there without ceremony, the way he did with most things he felt should be hers to open first. She stood at the table in her work coat with her cold hands, and she read it through once, then a second time, then set it down. She went to find Wyatt. He was in the barn doing the morning feeding, moving between the stalls with the unhurried efficiency of 12 years of the same work. He heard her come in and looked up. The finding came, she said. He set down what he was carrying, waited. They reviewed the original amendment request against the county processing records, she said. There was no record of the amendment being formally declined or approved. What they found instead was a notation in Shelby Poole's predecessor's files, the actual retired clerk, indicating that the amendment had been received, processed, and was awaiting final notation in the deed register. She paused. Poole never completed the notation. The letter says it appears to have been an administrative failure to complete the filing. Appears to have been, Wyatt said. That's the language they used. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the cows called from the near pasture, a long, uncomplicated complaint about the morning cold. The north parcel, she said. The finding confirms it as your property of continuous record. Peterson's challenge has no legal basis to proceed. He looked at her for a long moment. She waited because she'd learned when he needed a moment and when he needed to be rushed, and this was not a moment for rushing. He crossed the barn and took the letter from her hands and read it himself. She watched his face while he did. That face she'd spent 8 months learning to read, that face that did less than most people's, and meant more. When he finished, he handed it back. Cathcart's work, he said. Cathcart's work, Taggart's letter, Marcus Webb's statement, Cobb's account. She folded the letter. And the letter to the district office. Your letter, he said. She didn't argue with that. What happens to Poole? She asked. That's the district office's business, he said. Not mine. He said it without particular satisfaction. She respected that. There was nothing clean about what Poole had done or what it had nearly cost, and pretending the resolution was tidy would have been a lie, and they were both past the point of useful lies. She put the letter in her coat pocket. It sat there the way Bray's letter about the adjacent space had sat there in October. Something solid, something decided. I'm going to write to Cathcart today, she said, to close out the documentation. Yes, he said. He went back to the feeding. She went back to the house. The morning went on around them, ordinary and necessary and precisely what it was. Tempt. She told him she was taking the adjacent space in March. Not asked, told. She'd been deliberate about the word because the distinction mattered. She was not requesting permission, not looking for approval, not doing the old calculation about whether she was allowed to want something. She was telling him what she'd decided, the way two people who shared a life told each other things. He listened, and then he said, The supply costs are going to be significant in the first quarter. I know. I've run the numbers. She had the order book in front of her at the kitchen table. She'd been running the numbers for 3 weeks. If the spring orders hold, and based on the inquiries I have in hand, they will, I can carry the second month's rent by April and be comfortable by summer. He looked at the order book. at the numbers she'd written there, which were specific and honest and showed both the optimistic case and the conservative one, because that was how she'd learned to plan. "The south window's in," he said. "I know." He'd put it in himself, over 2 weekends in January, cutting and framing and glazing with the patient competence he brought to structural work. The east room now had light from 2 directions, morning and afternoon, and on clear days it was the brightest room in the house. "I want to hire someone," she said, "part-time to start. Someone who can do basic alterations and stitching while I'm managing the Cutter Street space. If I expand to the adjacent room, I can't do the volume alone. Do you have someone in mind?" "Clara Trent," she said. "She's 17. She came in 2 months ago with her mother for a fitting, and I watched her look at everything in the shop, the way I used to look at things when I was her age." She paused. "She knows basic stitching. I can teach her the rest." He was quiet for a moment. "Does her family know?" "I spoke with her mother last week." He almost smiled. She'd noticed this was how he smiled at things she'd done that he approved of. Not the expression itself, but the near approach of it, the slight movement of the lines around his eyes. "You already handled it," he said. "I didn't want to mention it until I knew it was real," she said. "And is it real?" "Clara starts Monday," she said. He did smile then. Actually smiled, fully, in the way that she'd seen maybe a dozen times in 8 months, and that never failed to change his face in a way that made her aware she'd been looking at a held-back version of it all the other times. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Clara Trent was quick, which was what Mabel had hoped for, and also a little chaotic, which was what she'd expected from a 17-year-old with more enthusiasm than discipline. She cut too fast and had to redo seams. She talked while she was working in a way that sometimes meant the talking won over the work. She had opinions about everything, delivered with the confident authority of someone who had not yet lived long enough to develop reliable doubt. Mabel let her talk. She corrected the seams without drama, showed her the cut again, handed back the work without editorial comment on how many times it had needed it. She thought about the women who had dismissed her own work when she was Clara's age, not cruelly, but with the casual condescension of people who assumed imprecision was a character trait rather than a skill gap. And she thought about what it would have meant to have someone just hand the work back and show her again. She handed it back. She showed her again. By the second week, Clara's seams were better. By the third, they were good. She was still talking too much, but the talking had started to contain more questions than opinions, which was a development Mabel considered encouraging. One afternoon, near the end of the month, Clara looked up from the alteration she was working on and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things all month," Mabel said. Something different. Clara's hands were still on the work. "People in town say things about how you came to be here, about Mr. Granger and the ranch, and about the wedding." Mabel kept working. "I know what people say," she said. "They make it sound like it was like you were—" Clara struggled with the word. "Like it was something that happened to you, that you couldn't help." "Some of it was," Mabel said. "Some things happened to you. But then you did all this." Clara gestured vaguely at the shop, at the east room through the connecting door, at something larger than both. "That part wasn't something that happened to you." Mabel stopped working. She put down the piece she was stitching and looked at the girl across from her. "No," she said. "That part wasn't." "So how did you—" Clara stopped herself, started differently. "Were you scared?" Mabel thought about the altar and the ride north, and the first morning in the kitchen garden at 5 in the morning before the light had properly come. She thought about walking into Bray's office and into the shop on Cutter Street. She thought about the letter to the district land office and the 4 drafts and the choice to stay factual when the anger was real and present and had a right to be there. "Yes, she said. "I was scared most of the time." "You didn't seem scared." "Seeming and being aren't the same thing," Mabel said. "Seeming is what you let the outside see. Being is what you work with." She picked up the stitching again. "The useful thing isn't not being scared. The useful thing is doing the next task that needs doing and letting the scared come along for the ride." Clara thought about this. "That's not what I expected you to say," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something more." Clara made a vague gesture. "More certain." "Certainty is mostly a performance," Mabel said. "Competence is real. If you develop competence in a thing, you trust that you can handle what the thing brings. That's about as close to certain as it gets." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her work again. I want to learn to draft patterns, she said. Not just alterations, the whole thing. I know you do, Mabel said. We'll get there. The proposal was not a grand event. She would have been suspicious of a grand event anyway. She had a built and specific history with public ceremonies and the thing they could become, and she was not in a rush to put herself in another position where the outcome depended on someone else's decisions in front of an audience. It happened in April, on the porch, which was where most of the real things between them had happened. The land was going green at the edges, the earliest green, the tentative kind that came in patches and could still be killed by a late frost, but that came anyway, every year, with the particular stubbornness of things that know what they're supposed to do. The creek was running higher with the snow melt from the hills, and the sound of it reached the porch in the evening as a low, continuous murmur. Wyatt had been quiet all day in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She'd noticed it, the way she noticed most things about him now, the particular texture of his silences, the difference between the one that meant he was thinking about something practical and the one that meant he was thinking about something he hadn't decided how to say yet. She waited. After supper, on the porch, with the light going long and gold across the hills, he said, I've been thinking about something. I can tell, she said. He looked at her. How long have you known? Since this morning, she said. Maybe yesterday evening. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I want to marry you. I've been wanting to say that for a while, and I've been taking my time with it, because I didn't want to say it wrong. She looked at the hills, at the green coming in at the edges, at the land that she knew now in the specific learned way, the fence lines and the water points, and the place where the north parcel met the web boundary, and the spot on the creek bank where she'd sat on the first day and thrown a stone into the water. There's nothing wrong about saying it, she said. I don't have a speech for it, he said. I thought about one. I couldn't make it sound like me. Good, she said. I don't want a speech. I've been at the end of a speech before. He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, this isn't that. I know it isn't, she said. And she did know. That was the thing that had taken the longest to trust, but she trusted it now. She'd earned the ability to trust it, through 8 months of evidence that was not dramatic or performed, but simply consistent, day after day, in the way that actually counted. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes? Yes, she said again. I want to marry you. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and put his hand over hers on the porch rail. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just put it there and left it. His hand was calloused and warm, and she was aware of it with her whole body. They sat like that for a while, with the green hills and the running creek and the last of the daylight going slow and easy over the ridge. When? He said. Not in a church, she said. No, he agreed immediately. Here, she said. This spring, when the hills are properly green. I'll ask Marcus Webb to witness, he said. He's been here as long as I have. And my parents, she said. And Ida Coleman, because she'll never forgive us if we don't. He almost laughed. She felt it rather than saw it, a slight change in the quality of the hand over hers. All right, he said. And Clara, she said. Clara will want to come. Clara will want to have opinions about all of it, he said. She will, Mabel agreed. I'll let her help with the dress. The wedding was on a Saturday in late May, on the flat ground between the house and the creek where the cottonwoods made their best showing of the year. The new leaves that particular bright green that didn't last more than a few weeks before deepening into summer. 22 people came, more than she'd expected, fewer than the church had held, which was exactly right. Her parents were there. Her father held her arm on the walk down to the creek, and his grip was the same as it had been on that first disastrous isle. Both hands, the silent kind of speaking. Her mother had cried getting ready that morning, and then recovered herself with a practicality that Mabel recognized as the family trait they shared. She hadn't tried to fix her mother's tears, just handed her a cloth and waited. Ida Coleman arrived in her buggy driving herself, wearing a coat that Mabel recognized as her own work. She'd done the lining herself 6 months ago, the silk ordered from the regional supplier. It fit perfectly. Dorothy Fenwick came. Mabel hadn't expected this and didn't make a production of it, but she saw Dorothy arrive and find a place to stand with the others. And when their eyes met briefly across the space, Dorothy nodded, just once, The small acknowledgement of a woman who had reconsidered something and was indicating the reconsideration without a speech about it. The dress was her own work, which everyone there knew. She'd made it over 3 weeks in March, working in the east room with the south window light and the morning light both, using a silk wool blend she'd ordered specifically, not ivory this time, but a deep warm cream that worked better against her coloring, which she knew now because she paid attention to such things rather than accepting whatever seemed available. Clara had helped with the embroidery at the collar, which was point lace and took longer than anything else in the garment and was exactly right. The dress was not the most beautiful thing in the world. It had one place at the left side seam where the fabric had pulled slightly during the final fitting, and she'd corrected it but could still see where it had been, the way you always saw your own corrections. She wore it anyway. She'd made it herself, and it was hers, and the correction was part of the making. Wyatt looked at her when she came down to the creek, in the way that she was still getting used to, the way that saw her first, before the calculation, before the assessment. Just saw her. The particular person she was, as though that were the only thing worth registering. There was no reverend. They'd asked Marcus Webb, who'd been on the frontier long enough to know that the words themselves were what mattered, and the official standing of the person saying them was secondary to whether everyone present believed what they were witnessing. Marcus Webb was a man everyone present believed in. He said the necessary words in his brief, factual manner. They said yes. The creek ran behind them, and the cottonwoods made their spring light through the new leaves, and 22 people watched without it being a performance. She thought, briefly, about 47 people watching her walk down a different aisle toward a man who was already deciding to leave. She thought about it and then let it go. Not because it hadn't happened, not because it didn't matter, but because it was one part of the story and not the whole of it, and she was no longer in the business of letting one part stand in for everything. The adjacent space on Cutter Street opened the following month. She kept the sign the same, Cross Sewing Works, just larger, spanning both windows now. She'd been back and forth about changing the name, adding Granger, making the marriage visible in the business. She'd decided against it, not because she was hiding anything. Everyone in the county knew what had happened by now, the social telegraph of the frontier being what it was, but because the business was hers, had been built from what she'd brought to it, and the name was part of what she'd built. Wyatt agreed with this without hesitation, which she'd known he would, and which she appreciated anyway. Clara was full-time by summer, and was teaching herself to draft patterns from the textbook Mabel had ordered from the catalog. The right catalog. The one for trade professionals that had the technical rather than the decorative emphasis. Clara still talked too much, and her cutting was still occasionally overconfident, and she had a habit of redesigning pieces in her head while she was supposed to be executing them as drawn, which required managing. She was also, genuinely, becoming a fine seamstress. Mabel told her this on a Thursday when the day's work was done, and Clara had finished an alteration that was, objectively, well done. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone not sure whether to believe a compliment they'd wanted. "It's good work," Mabel said. "Not perfect. The left sleeve is 2 millimeters longer than the right. You'll need to watch for that in your own hand." Clara looked at the sleeve, made a face. "But good," Mabel said. Genuinely. Clara nodded with the controlled seriousness of someone trying not to show that this mattered. It mattered. Mabel had known it would. She remembered what it felt like to have someone tell you that you were actually capable of something, not as consolation, not as encouragement in the empty motivational sense, but as a factual assessment by a person whose opinion was worth having. She remembered how rare that had been and how much it had counted when it came. She was in a position to give it now. She didn't take that lightly. 8 months after the district land office confirmed Wyatt's title to the north parcel, Dale Peterson left the county. She heard about it through the usual channels, Cobb passing information sideways in the way he'd always done. Peterson had apparently encountered similar documentation problems with 2 other property challenges in the region, and the district office had begun a formal inquiry into the pattern of incomplete filings during Shelby Poole's tenure. Poole himself had resigned from the county clerk position in March, before the inquiry reached its conclusions. She received this information and filed it in the same place she'd filed a lot of things from the past year. Not forgotten, not dwelt on, just placed accurately in the account of how things had gone and what they had required. What it had required was documentation and persistence and 2 people who didn't let the problem live in only one of their heads. That was the truth of it, stripped of drama. Problems that looked intractable generally had a piece that could be addressed first, and then a piece after that, and you addressed them in order and didn't stop because the hole was too large to see at once. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings on the ranch porch. Theirs now. In the way that things become yours when you've worked on them and stayed through the difficult parts and planted something in the ground with your own hands. She thought about what the year had required of her. Not from the altitude of triumph, because that was a dishonest place to look at things from. The year had been hard in ways that she'd been surprised by, even when she'd tried to prepare. And she'd gotten things wrong and had to correct them. And there had been nights in the East Room where she'd sat with the lamp burning and felt the weight of what she was carrying and not been sure she was carrying it right. She thought about what she would tell a woman who was at the beginning of it, at the altar in the beautiful dress, watching someone choose to leave. She wouldn't say it gets easier. That was the comfortable lie that sounded like kindness. She'd say, "You're going to find out what you're actually made of, and some of it's going to surprise you, and the surprised feeling doesn't go away. You just learn to use it. You're going to be scared and do the thing anyway, and the next time you're scared, you'll have evidence that you can do the thing anyway, and that evidence accumulates until it starts to feel like something you can stand on. You're going to have to let people help you. Not as rescue. Rescue is one person carrying something that belongs to another, which eventually makes both of them worse. But as partnership, as two people seeing a problem that belongs to both of them and addressing it from both their angles at once. That's different. That's worth learning to accept. And the people who looked at you and decided early what you were, some of them are going to revise. Not all of them. Maybe not even most of them. But some. And the ones who do will surprise you with how far a person can travel from where they started, when they're given evidence that contradicts what they assumed. The woman at the altar wasn't weak. She just didn't know yet what she could build. That's the only difference between the beginning and the end. Not strength. She had it then too. Just knowledge. The accumulated, hard-earned, specific knowledge of what she was capable of, gathered from the evidence of her own life. The ranch was quiet on an evening in October, a full year from when Mabel had first looked at it from the wagon seat with Wyatt beside her, a woman in borrowed clothes who'd just walked away from the worst morning of her life. The creek was lower in the fall. The snowmelt was long past, and the water ran shallow over its stones, making a quieter sound than it had in spring. The cottonwoods were going yellow at the edges. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for the season, the beds turned and covered, the last of the harvest in the root cellar. She and Wyatt sat on the porch. Her order book for November was full. The adjacent space on Cutter Street had made the difference she'd projected. The spring numbers had held, the summer numbers had exceeded them, and she'd stopped doing the anxious calculations every week somewhere around July when it became clear that the business was what she'd believed it could be. Clara was taking her first custom order on her own. Mabel had looked over the measurements twice and said they were right. "I've been thinking about the north pasture," Wyatt said. "What about it?" "I want to expand the herd there next spring. The land's been sitting light since I was running it at minimal stock during the dispute. It can support more." He paused. "I'd need to bring on another hand for the season." "Cobb might be ready to leave Taggart," she said. "He's been looking restless." I'd noticed. She filed that away. She had a good sense now of how Wyatt noticed things. He noticed most things, more than he indicated, storing information with the patience of a man who understood that timing was part of usefulness. "I might talk to him," she said. "At the shop. He comes in for the Taggart mending." "You don't need to manage it," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm offering." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you." She looked at the hills. The light was going in the way it went in October. Quickly, decisively, the sunset not lingering the way it did in summer. The hills went from brown to gray to the soft dark of early evening. "I want to teach Clara to draft trousers," she said. "The women's pattern. There's a real need for it that nobody's addressing in the region." "Then address it," he said. She thought about what that would look like, about what she'd need and what Clara would need and what the customers would bring to it. The women who wore practical clothes and had been wearing things that didn't fit for years because the practical end of the market assumed a body that most of them didn't have. She thought about Frances Alderman's coat and how she'd stood in front of that small mirror and said it was the first one that had ever fit. There was more of that work to do. There was a lot more of it. "The shop's going to need more space eventually," she said. "Eventually," he agreed. "Not yet." "No. Not yet." A coyote called from the direction of the lower pasture, the same spot as always, or near enough. The sound traveled up through the cooling air and settled. She was not the woman the town had decided she was. She hadn't been, for a long time, though it had taken her longer than it should have to trust that. She was not Thomas Hale's abandoned bride or the object of anyone's pity or the woman in the wrong body for the life she wanted. She was a seamstress and a business owner and a rancher's wife and a teacher and a keeper of difficult problems and a planter of kitchen gardens and a writer of careful letters to district offices and a person who knew the specific weight of a tamping bar and the 12 measurements that built a garment for a real body. She was Mabel Cross, and she had earned the right to take up exactly this much space in the world, and she intended to keep doing it. The hills went dark. The stars came out. The creek kept running over its stones in the dark below the cottonwoods, making its small, persistent sound. The same sound it had made the first day she'd sat on its bank and thrown a stone into the water and decided to start from where the integrity was. She was still starting from there. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.